and I want to welcome in this panel three very estimated guests who have been ready to participate in our discussion. It is first Professor Carlos Carrera, the Executive Director of the South Center. Welcome, Carlos, to our panel. I also want to welcome Dimitri Einikel, Policy Team Coordinator and EU Advisor of the Médecins Sans Frontières, to the Ärzte ohne Grenzen, yes. And I also want to welcome Sangeeta Shashikan, TWN Legal Advisor to the Third World Network, Coordinator of the Third World Network Office in Geneva. And if you allow, I will switch to German and to make a short description about what we are discussing and where we are here. The new appointed WTO Director, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, has just expressed the first weeks of her taking over of the responsibility of the WTO that she wants to make it a task that the WTO has to contribute in this special situation where we are to struggle successfully the pandemic COVID-19. And it is the responsibility of the WTO to allow and to give access for the last developed countries, the poor countries, the global south to the vaccines. And I think this is a very interesting opening of her responsibility of her taking over, because it is just a break away from the traditional approach within the WTO, how to deal with it. So I switch to German for the translators. Wir sind bestimmt alle uns darüber im Klaren, dass die Pandemie ein globales Problem ist und dass deshalb diese Worte von der WTO-Direktorin so wichtig sind. Wie weit ist globale Gesundheit, inwieweit ist das Recht auf Impfstoffe durchsetzbar vor dem Hintergrund der realen völkerrechtlichen und nationalen Regelungen? Leider gibt es weder in der EU-Grundrechtecharta noch in vielen nationalen Verfassungen, darunter auch nicht im deutschen Grundgesetz, ein Recht auf Gesundheit. Das heißt, die verfassungsrechtlichen Grundlagen für die Durchsetzung dieses Anspruchs von vielen, vielen Millionen und Milliarden Menschen ist sozusagen rechtlich so nicht gesichert. Und deshalb war und ist aus meiner Sicht der Vorstoß erst von Kamerun schon gleich am Anfang des Jahres 2020, als es darum ging, sich auf die Herausforderung des Zugangs zu Impfstoffen einzulassen, und zwar über das sogenannte CTAP-Modell, einen Pool zu schaffen für den Zugang zu Covid-9-relevanten Technologien, so wichtig, als auch der Vorschlag Südafrikas und Indiens, etwas später, einen Waiver zu dem TRIPS-Abkommen zuzulassen und eine Ausnahme von den gegenwärtig in Kraft befindlichen Regularien des TRIPS-Abkommens zu ermöglichen. Das wäre machbar, weil es um die Mindeststandardsregelung von geistigem Eigentum geht, also des Schutzes von geistigem Eigentum, und damit eine Ausnahme von dem 20 Jahre lang geltenden Patentschutz innerhalb der internationalen Vereinbarung des TRIPS-Abkommens. Und das wäre sozusagen eine Möglichkeit, dass hier exklusive Vermarktungsrechte für die Patenteinhaber aufgehoben wird. Aber leider haben von Anfang an alle Industrienationen, darunter auch die EU-Mitgliedstaaten, sich geweigert, diesen Vorstößen Folge zu leisten. Und jetzt dauert diese Diskussion innerhalb der WTO an. Und ich würde, um es nicht zu lang werden zu lassen, Vielleicht Professor Carlos Correa gleich zum Eingang unserer Debatte bitten, zu diesen Aspekten aus seiner Sicht zu sprechen, weil wir auch zugleich noch die Fragestellung haben, wie müssen wir mit der COVAX Facility umgehen? Das heißt, ein an die WHO angedocktes Gebilde aus Pharmaindustrie, Regierung und bestimmten Stiftungen, wie zum Beispiel die Bill Gates Stiftung, die sich sozusagen auf Spendenbasis, also als Almosen an die Länder sozusagen bereit erklärt haben, dort eine bestimmte Grundversorgung zur Verfügung zu stellen. Aber dieses Recht auf die Patentfreigabe und damit die Ermöglichung der Produktion von Impfstoffen in vielen Staaten der Erde zu ermöglichen, weil, das hatte ich eingangs gesagt, der Kampf gegen die Pandemie ein globales Problem ist und wir werden es nur erfolgreich bestehen, diesen Kampf, wenn wir diese globale Dimension auch real sozusagen anerkennen und entsprechende Vereinbarungen der internationalen Staatengemeinschaft ermöglichen. Professor Carlos Correa, ich würde Ihnen das Wort geben.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate at this webinar. So I will make a brief introduction about the relationship between intellectual property rights and access to health, in particular access to vaccines and pharmaceutical products. Secondly, I will make reference to some examples of how intellectual property may actually pose obstacles to access to vaccines, and in particular for the expansion of manufacturing capacity. And finally, I will very briefly refer to the possible solution to this, in particular the waiver has been referred to. So as we know, it has been already mentioned, there is a basic human right in terms of getting access to health, and this needs access to pharmaceutical products, including vaccines. On the other hand, intellectual property rights provide monopoly rights, in particular patents, for instance, they provide for a legal monopoly for 20 years from the date of filing the application. And in some countries, this in Europe, for instance, in other countries, this term may extend it even farther than for 20 years. The same applies to other intellectual property rights, such as designs, which are important, for instance, for equipment, or respirators, know-how, or trade secrets. So there is a tension between intellectual property rights and access to health, including access to vaccine, which has been now been made quite apparent in the case of the COVID, in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. So we find two approaches in relation to how these tensions should be dealt with. On the one hand, the UN Secretary General, the Secretary General of the United Nations, made a statement in April 2020 saying that products relating to the treatment, prevention of COVID-19 should be considered global public goods. So this statement was taken by some head of states at the World Health Assembly that took place in September on a virtual format. The Chinese president made reference to the concept. The president of France made reference to the need of ensuring universal access to vaccine and that products for COVID-19. But in fact, this concept has not come into reality because of the fact that there has been no real solidarity in the context of the international community in order to ensure that this concept is actually implemented. There have been some initiatives that aim at making this concept a reality. One of these was an initiative by the President of Costa Rica to establish a pool of technologies that now is working under the auspices of the World Health Organization, the so-called CTAP. So the aim of this pool was to ensure that companies owning technologies will share these technologies in order to expand manufacturing capacity, in particular in developing countries. But today, although this initiative has the support of about 40 members of the World Health Organization, there's been no single transfer of technology or sharing of technology by the pharmaceutical companies, the so-called big pharma, which has rejected the very idea of sharing the technologies in order to ensure that more manufacturing of vaccines takes place. There are other initiatives, such as the Open COVID Place initiative, which was also launched with the objective of sharing patented technology and know-how. But if you look at the companies that have endorsed this initiative, there is no pharmaceutical company among them. So this approach about making vaccines a public good has not come to a reality. So the other side is the fact that the pharmaceutical industry, supported by many organizations, argue that intellectual property should be enforced during the time of the COVID-19. They say that, in fact, intellectual property will promote innovation, and that is necessary to recognize intellectual property in this period and enforce patents and other rights. The concept is that in the absence of this protection, there will be no further innovation. But the reality is very different. Intellectual property is granted in accordance to the modern theory about intellectual property in order to address what is called a market failure. So the fact that some companies may invest in doing research and development, and they will not be able to recover the cost of research and development in case that competition arises. But in the case of COVID-19 vaccines in particular, in the first place, there is a huge demand, 7.99 billion people waiting for the vaccine, so a huge demand and a sure demand. Secondly, the companies, the Western companies in particular, have received massive subsidies in order to develop and undertake trials for the vaccines. In the case of Moderna, for instance, from the United States, they received 2.5 billion of taxpayers' money. In accordance to a BBC report, the pharmaceutical companies that produce vaccines in Europe and the United States may have received up to 6.5 billion of public resources in order to undertake development and trial. So in this case, quite clearly, the argument about the market failure does not work. So let me just mention a few examples that show why intellectual property may become an obstacle in order to address the COVID-19 crisis. If you look, for instance, at the situation of protective masks, you may think that this is a very common product today, but around 1,000 patents have been identified in connection with protective masks, and there were some issues in the United States in relation to the enforcement of these patents. In connection with vaccines, a study conducted by the World Intellectual Property Organization in 2012, you may say it's outdated, but at that time, the study identified 11,800 patent families in connection with vaccines. So the vaccines field is a field in which there is a significant proliferation of patenting. In the case of Moderna, for instance, Moderna has declared that they obtained 240 patents around the vaccines that they developed with this new technology. And in accordance with an information provided to the investors by Moderna, they argue that there are other patents which are held by third parties that may also impinge upon the production of Moderna vaccines. Now is going on a lawsuit in the United States in which a biotech company, Lilly Biotechnology and Pharmaceuticals, is suing Pfizer because Pfizer has allegedly used and infringed a patent of this company on a fluorescent protein, which is used in order to make trials of the Pfizer vaccine. So this is a quite clear case in which an obstacle has arisen. There has been also some dispute between Moderna and another company in the United States, Arbutus Biopharma, in relation to 3 patents that also concern the technology that's used by Moderna. Even the NIH, the National Institute of Health of the United States, has claimed that they have developed patents and they hold patent rights over COVID-19 related technologies. This is a stabilized coronavirus spike protein, which has been patented. A researcher and a professor at one university in Israel has also filed a patent in the United States in relation to COVID-19 vaccines. So this is the situation. Intellectual property do have an impact in terms of the possibility or not to producing vaccine. This also applies to treatment. As you know, there have been some expectations, for instance, about the use of remdesivir for COVID-19. Also about the use of Kaletra. The companies holding patents on this made a pledge that they will not enforce these patents. In the case of Moderna, they have also made a pledge not to use the patent during the COVID-19, but they are saying that after COVID-19, they will actually enforce the patent. And this pledge by many analysts is just a strategy in order to promote the diffusion of this new platform for developing vaccines. And then later on use this platform in order to get royalties from everybody using this technology. The same did Microsoft many years ago when they promoted they tolerated the use of the Windows system in order to ensure a wide dissemination of the system in order for this to become a universal kind of standard for operating system. So these pledges do not help too much. And there is also risk that in many countries, including in the European Union, it might be possible to get what is called patents on the second medical use. That means that even if a medicine is known for a particular medicinal use, if another use is found, for instance, for COVID-19, then a new patent might be granted again for 20 years or more. So for some, the solution to this dilemma is voluntary licensing. It's just the companies given on a voluntary basis license to other manufacturers. This has not happened, in fact. There are a few contracts, manufacturing contracts, for instance, by AstraZeneca, but it has not been enough. And the fact is that if we continue following this path, as it was mentioned by the introductory statements, there will be no availability of vaccines, even for developed countries. European Union and United States and others are facing shortages of vaccines, but this will be particularly the case for developing countries. So what the options are? One of the options which is on the table, has been referred to, is to waive the provisions in the TRIPS agreement. This is an important agreement in the context of WTO, which obliges all members, including developing country members, to provide protection for patents, designs, trade secrets, which are quite important for the manufacturing of vaccines. So this waiver, it was mentioned, has been launched as an initiative by India, South Africa. It has a very important support from a large number of the membership of the WTO, but a strong opposition by developed countries, including so far the European Union. So I hope that what the Parliament is doing will help this position to change, including, of course, the opposition from the United States and other developed countries. But the waiver may provide a way to facilitate other producers in developing countries in particular to start manufacturing in the area of vaccines, and therefore to provide vaccines in a situation in which shortages are a main problem. It is mentioned that there is always an alternative, and this is the use of the TRIPS flexibilities, including compulsory licenses. This is, of course, important, and these flexibilities must be reaffirmed, but granting compulsory license country by country is a more burdensome process. It may require, for instance, in some cases, negotiations with companies that held the patents. It may take time. There may be appeals against the decision which are taken. In addition to this, compulsory license does not apply to patent applications or patents which have not been granted yet, but which may become a barrier. So therefore, the waiver is a global solution. It's a solution that will allow both developed and developing countries to timely enter into manufacturing for treatment or for vaccines. And therefore, it is, well, we hope that at the meeting that is going on, there will be a situation in which developed countries do understand that this is an emergency. An emergency requires exceptional measures. An emergency requires a real solidarity, which does not, it is not just to be proclaimed. Solidarity must be actually put in practice. Thank you very much again for the invitation. I'm open to any questions that may arise.
Thank you, Professor Correa. I would switch immediately to our next guest, Dimitri Einikel from the policy team on the medicines frontier. And I would suggest that we then, after all the three introductory remarks, come to the debate discussion. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning. I hope you can hear me. Thank you everyone for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here on this two-day event organized by GOE, and it's a pleasure to be side by side with Professor Correa and Sangeeta, who we often collaborate very well. I will first say a few things about the global inequity and the European Union role in the global pandemic. And then I will talk a bit about some inconsistencies with regards to the EU's position at the WTO compared to its own domestic policies and bilateral trade policies. First of all, you know, as has already been noted by the previous speakers, the global inequity is dire, both at the moment. Our teams are witnessing, for example, in South Africa, Malawi, Mozambique, overwhelmed healthcare systems where healthcare workers are not even vaccinated at the moment, struggling to cope with an influx of many patients. But at the same time, it's also dire on the longer term. You know, there are, according to certain reports, some populations may only be vaccinated in 2024. That is way too late, considering that this is a global pandemic. And as previous speakers have noted, the risk of new mutations and variants, which are highly infectious and may undermine existing vaccines, is considerable. And we need to take into account that we need to be faster in terms of vaccinating populations. So we need to have faster access to more vaccines. We need to increase the production of vaccines. With regards to the European Union, there are a couple of things that the European Union has done pretty well in terms of political support for the creation of the ACT Accelerator, COVAX, a 1 billion pledge to COVAX for the purchase of vaccines, which is the largest pledge to date, as well as a large investment in research and development and production of vaccines. According to Professor Suri Moon, this is about 20 billion or even more, 20 billion euros or even more that has been invested by the European Union, which has really pushed the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. We have to acknowledge that. It shows what is possible when the financial means are available ahead of the research and development. And in that regard, also, it's welcome to look at the creation of ERA to continue such efforts in the future for future pandemics, which already relates a bit to the question of the narrative that IP is needed as an incentive for innovation. If we're going to build new structures for the development of vaccines, one can question, of course, whether those monopolies are still needed at the time. At the same time, we also have to look at the European vaccine strategy as one that is really centered around the European production of vaccine. A lot of this money has been used to invest and support the production of vaccines in Europe. And Europe is also one of the main purchasers of those vaccines, with currently reserving about 2.6 billion vaccines to date. As I mentioned, there is a large global inequity and we need to go faster. We need to go faster in terms of production, particularly outside Europe. There are options available. Professor Correa already noted the importance of intellectual property rights. I would add or particularly emphasize as well the sharing of know-how in that regards. The sharing of the know-how of how to produce the vaccines will really help to enable faster production, while the IP rights, lifting the IP rights would allow the production of vaccines, which are two linked but quite slightly separate issues, of course. There are definitely options in terms of speeding up the production of vaccines when it concerns the new mRNA vaccines, where there's a lot of attention to, because they're far easier to reproduce if you know how to do it. A lot of pharmaceutical companies who have not produced vaccines in the past would be able to apply the production of those vaccines, because it's a rather simple process to use. Now, when it comes to intellectual property rights, there are a couple of points where the European Union has been rather inconsistent in its approach to the TRIPS waiver. Mostly, or first of all, it has emphasized the use of compulsory licensing, as Professor Correa already pointed out. Now, if we look at intellectual property rights and compulsory licensing, there is some similarity with the HIV crisis 20 years ago, when there were a lot of medicines that were not available or affordable at the time, particularly in Africa, to fight the HIV pandemic. Currently, obviously, it's related to a lot more tools to go against the COVID-19 pandemic. However, there's also a difference. There has been an evolution in those 20 years. At the time, it was acknowledged, the importance of generic production of those medicines, HIV medicines, was considered an important achievement. But what we have seen now is, first of all, with compulsory licensing, it's very difficult to do importation and exportation. Only once there has been an importation with the use of compulsory licensing. My organization, Médecins Sans Frontières, was involved in that, and it took 4 years to get the medicine from Canada to Rwanda. So that's a main limitation, that in a time of a pandemic really makes it difficult to collaborate, share vaccine components, etc., to manufacture together, and import and export, for example, the vaccines or other products. Another major limitation is that besides patents, there are other forms of intellectual property, such as data exclusivity and trade secrets. And particularly the issue of trade secrets here is of importance because it allows companies to legally protect information with regards to the production, for example, of vaccines, on how to produce them. That even in court, it would not be possible to get access to that kind of information, that the company could be persuaded to share that information, or actually to be forced to share that information. So compared to 20 years ago, there are more or stronger monopolies that are currently being in use, regardless of patent protection, that are more difficult to circumvent. And that is in relation as well to a scientific advance. If you look at certain medicines of 20 years ago, some of them were rather simple molecules, which are rather easy to reproduce. Currently, we're also looking a lot more at biological products and rather complex vaccines, where access to information on how to produce them is really key in terms of speeding up production. And again, this links with the issue of trade secrets, where if you cannot get access to that kind of information, it's a lot slower to reproduce them. Now, why is it contradictory what the European Union has been saying? Well, first of all, the European Union at the WTO and at the TRIPS Council strongly emphasizes the use of compulsory license as a legitimate tool, which is a welcome position, of course, but it puts it in contradiction to the waiver, saying basically we need compulsory licensing, we don't need a waiver. Well, as I just mentioned, there are limitations to compulsory licensing. So if you would actually support compulsory licensing, you obviously want to support a position of compulsory licensing that is effective, meaning that governments have the ability to allow generic production and then also use it to the maximum extent possible in a global pandemic. So if you would really endorse compulsory licensing, in a way, you would also enter into a constructive dialogue on the proponents of the waiver on how to make it most effective. Secondly, it's actually rather contradictory that the European Union states that it's supporting compulsory licensing, and actually states that it never questioned the use of compulsory licenses in terms of need, which is literally what the European Union has said at the WTO. While we know that in bilateral trade agreements and also in the EU's IP enforcement reports that the European Union drafts every 2 years, it has actually criticized countries for amending its laws to facilitate compulsory licensing. So it directly contradicts some of the other policy tools that the European Union is applying, discouraging countries from using compulsory licensing, while at the same time saying it is encouraging compulsory licensing to counter the TRIPS waiver. Then in the EU's IP action plan, for those who are familiar with it, the European Union is also supporting regional collaboration in the EU with regards to compulsory licensing, basically saying we want to share the benefits of compulsory licensing, such as negotiations over royalties that need to be paid to pharmaceutical companies, that we share this information, etc. I would argue that the main benefit of compulsory licensing is actually the access to the final products. That's exactly what the system was created for, or the tool was created for, and actually what the waiver wants to be able to do. As I mentioned, the main concern with compulsory licensing is the difficulty for importation and exportation, while the waiver would take away some of these barriers, some of this red tape, which would allow one country which has the possibility to manufacture some of the ingredients of a vaccine to collaborate with another producer in another country that can produce the final product, which in the current compulsory licensing law is very difficult or nearly impossible to do. So there again, promoting regional collaboration in the EU while at the same time hampering regional collaboration at the international level. A third point is regards to, or a third argument that the European Union has used at the World Trade Organization in opposition to the waiver is that it says that all countries have the abilities to attach conditions to public funding on R&D, saying there are other tools to get access to vaccines if countries wish to do so. While the EU itself has actually not attached conditions to ensure access to, for example, COVID-19 vaccines, there was a letter last year, about 1 year ago, exactly 1 year ago, in March, because I looked it up in March last year, signed by 30 MEPs asking the European Union, if you are going to fund the development of COVID-19 tools and particularly vaccines, make sure there are non-exclusive rights attached to this vaccine so that any producer would be able to produce them in the world, that you can allow a lot more production than just European production. And the European Union has not done that. So now it's preaching that other countries should attach conditions while it hasn't done any of that itself. A final point I want to make is with regards to the sharing of know-how. It came up a couple of times already. The European Union says, well, it's not so much the intellectual property barrier that is a problem, it's the sharing of manufacturing know-how. You need to know how to produce the vaccine. We need to be able to share that the technology or that knowledge. Well, we agree to that. We agree, of course, that needs to happen. But at the same time, the European Union has been promoting the trade secrets on such on sharing of know-how, which actually makes it a lot more difficult to get access to that level of information. And even more so, there's actually a lack of tools to force companies to share such essential information for public health in a time of crisis, even in the EU. I would even go a step further. In the latest EU-China trade investment agreements, the European Union asks China no longer to stop its practice of forced technology transfers or the ability to access trade secrets, which could actually, in this pandemic, which would be quite an essential step. So the ability to go to companies and ask them to share essential information on the production, for example, of vaccines, there is no, as far as we know, maybe there is a tool that I don't know of, but as far as we know, there is no tool in the EU. And the countries that do have the ability to do so, it actually encourages them to stop this practice and to take away this tool from them. Well, this is actually an important tool that we can use in this pandemic. So to conclude, there are two elements. As I said, there is a possibility to upscale the production of vaccines rapidly, and that needs to happen soon in this pandemic. And that is by sharing the know-how and lifting intellectual property barriers, such as through the waiver. And secondly, we need to look at the EU's trade policy and the pressure it has exerted on other countries to actually weaken their ability to protect global health, such as in a time of crisis as today, by encouraging them to take away some of their policy tools to protect public health, which contradicts exactly the position that the European Union is currently preaching at the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Challenging introduction, and I think we have a lot to discuss after your contribution as well. So, and now I give the floor to Sangeeta Shashikan. Welcome to our panel, and just immediately the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my presentation. So there might be a bit of overlap with the previous speakers, so I'll try and go fast there. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be on this panel to contribute to the discussion. So I just want to say that, the starting point for the addressing COVID-19 is to recognize that COVID-19 is wreaking havoc on people's lives across the world, developed countries, developing countries, least developed countries. And if we want to curb COVID-19 pandemic in the shortest possible time frame, we need prompt access to COVID-19 medical products. This includes diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And I think it was in this context 1 year ago, we had the EU claiming commitment to global public goods. We had President Macron, Chancellor Angela Merkel, the President of the European Commission, von der Leyen, talking very much about the need to develop vaccines, for this to be available everywhere, to everyone as soon as possible. It should not be appropriated. President Macron went on as far as to say, you know, human health cannot be quarreled over, cannot be appropriated, cannot be bought and sold. Angela Merkel was saying, you know, we should have these vaccines as in many places as possible in the world. It should be a global public good. So these are all the claimed commitments that have been made at the start of the pandemic. There was a claim for international solidarity. And so there was actually great hope that this time around, the situation would be very different. We would move away from business as usual approaches to ensure equitable access. And unfortunately, this is not what we have seen, because since the very beginning, instead of international solidarity, what we have seen is really disparity in access, COVID-19 medical products. So it is not just about vaccines. From the very beginning, we have issues with access to diagnostics, with therapeutics as well. There was a report by UNCTAD, a global trade report, which actually pointed out that middle and low income countries have been largely priced out of access. For every $10 per month of imports of COVID products in high income countries, it is $1 in middle income countries, and like 10 cents in low and middle income, low income countries. So the difference in access is actually staggering. And this is an issue not just now, but since the beginning of the pandemic. If you just look at, we speak a lot about vaccines, but one of the aspects, if we want to curb the pandemic, is really access to COVID testing. But you see huge disparity in access to COVID testing. If you look at developed countries, reported tests per million population is more than 700,000 as compared to developing countries, more than 100,000, and least developed countries, about 17,000. We definitely know that I'm sure you've heard of the situation of vaccines. For 16% of the world population, the high income population, they have confirmed number of doses, the most 4.6 billion doses, as compared to 84% of the world population that has got significant, much lower access to doses. So this is the kind of disparity that we are facing. If we want true equitable access, we need availability and we need affordability. And for this to happen, we need to scale up global manufacturing. We need to diversify suppliers globally, and especially in developing countries, not only, but especially in developing countries, because a large part of the world population lives in the developing world. And we all say everyone is, no one is safe until everyone is safe. It's a fact that to the extent that COVID-19 is not under control in developing countries where vulnerable populations are unprotected, new mutations are going to arise, and it's going to come back and affect developed countries as well. So if we want to look at equitable access, we really need to scale up global manufacturing and diversify suppliers globally, especially in developing countries. Instead, what we have seen today is really business as usual approaches in the past that where we also had issues of access have now been exacerbated on a real massive global scale because of the business as usual voluntary licensing approaches. And these approaches are actually limiting production, and they are artificially constraining supply. COVID-19 is a huge lucrative market. So there is huge interest in protecting this monopoly, huge commercial interest in protecting monopoly, but it comes at a great cost for public health and people's lives globally. So what is the relevance of intellectual property? Professor Correa and Dimitri have already highlighted this. When we look at the range of medical products that are needed to deal with COVID-19, whether it's test kits, masks, medicines, vaccines, ventilators, different types of artificial intelligence, there are different types of categories of intellectual property that become relevant. A lot of the conversation is around patents, but Dimitri mentioned about know-how, trade secrets. So if we look at test kits, There you will have issues around trade secrets and patents. We have seen, for instance, the recipe for making reagents was not accessible in countries that would be protected by trade secrets. Masks, Professor Correa talked about the hundreds and thousands of patents around masks, especially N95 masks. Even in the US, there was concern that this was inaccessible. Also, you've got issues around industrial designs, medicines, issues around patents, vaccines, there'll be issues around patents, trade secrets, that could be also issues around copyright and industrial designs as well. So a lot has been said about vaccines. I just wanted to show you a patent landscape for some of these key therapeutics that are being considered quite seriously for curbing COVID-19, where you'll see that there are many patent applications filed or granted in many jurisdictions around the world. For instance, 85 to 7, there are about 60 jurisdictions that have been covered. And this does not even cover the global landscape of patent applications. These are primarily in developing countries. So this is where the TRIPS waiver becomes especially relevant. We are not just talking about patents, we're talking about different categories of intellectual property that we would need to waive to actually boost global supply. And so this is the basis for the India and South Africa proposal that was presented on 2nd October, and that has actually generated huge support globally, but also in the WTO, where it is now co-sponsored by 57 countries and supported by the majority of the WTO membership. So what this proposal is seeking to achieve is for relevant aspects of the intellectual property obligations in the WTO agreement to waive the implementation, application, and enforcement of these relevant sections. And it is not all aspects of the WTO agreement. It is not for all diseases. It's really to handle the current COVID-19 pandemic and global health emergency that we are facing globally. There is a very concrete legal basis in Article 9 of the WTO agreement. The reason I'm highlighting is to say that the WTO agreement itself recognizes that when there are exceptional circumstances, you can actually waive certain obligations of the WTO agreement. And this is what the proposal is all about. This is not the first time a waiver has been undertaken in the context of the WTO, in the context of intellectual property in the WTO. In terms of duration, again, it is not forever. It is supposed to be for a specific duration. There is no specific duration determined for now, but the proposal does say that it is until widespread vaccination is in place globally, and the majority has developed immunity. Now, it's important to understand that we are dealing with a totally novel pathogen. There are many uncertainties, there are many unknowns, and this is actually what the world is grappling with currently. So what will this waiver achieve? The main idea is really recognition at the WTO level that countries have freedom to operate by suspending the implementation and enforcement of relevant IP obligations. Countries have full freedom to operate, to do what they need to do, to actually boost manufacturing. This also avoids a lot of the procedural and administrative delays that are associated with perhaps using some of the TRIPS flexibilities. Depending on how your national law puts in place the procedures for TRIPS flexibilities, it can take some time. So this is to just avoid the procedural and administrative delay. And by implementing the waiver at the national level, you do not then have to address the IP issues on IP by IP basis or a product by product basis. You have kind of addressed that in one go. So it is to make it really easier to address that barrier. It allows collaboration. Once we have lifted this intellectual property monopoly, it can actually facilitate collaboration. It can be South-South collaboration, it can be North-South collaboration, it can be international collaboration, it can be regional collaboration for the development and production and supply of medical products. It can facilitate economies of scale. It becomes more viable for companies if they have got a few countries, bigger markets that they are supplying. It can also reduce the cost of production. It can be a huge incentive for production. And of course, it supports countries with insufficient manufacturing. Not all countries have got manufacturing capacity. There are some countries that can manufacture parts of it. There are other countries that can manufacture other parts of it. So it's really to come together to actually collaborate for the production. And there's some countries that cannot manufacture any part of it, and to make it easier to supply these countries as well. Now, some of these arguments that the EU is putting forward is, firstly, in a lot of the discussions, they said they have always supported the COVAX facility. They have given significant funds to this facility, and Dimitri has already mentioned it. But Dr. Tedros, of the Director General of WHO, made a very important point. You say money is irrelevant if there are no vaccines to supply. It's also irrelevant if you've got no diagnostic kits that are available. So the main issue here is really to boost production. The facility itself has been struggling to get sufficient supply, but if we can boost production, the COVAX facility itself will have adequate supply. Currently, the COVAX facility, the ambition is quite low in the sense that it is only 2 billion doses to be delivered in 2021. If we want to bring COVID-19 pandemic under control, it is a fact that we need to vaccinate large parts of the world population with an effective vaccine. And so the 2 billion doses, while it is useful in giving some protection, especially to the health workers, those that are at high risk, but it is inadequate to what we need to bring the pandemic under control. It's inadequate for the needs of 6.4 billion people in low and middle income countries. So I think we have a huge challenge here on our hands. One argument they always say, EU will always say, is we support, you need technology, you need know-how, and there is voluntary licensing. But what we have seen is this voluntary licensing is a very ad hoc tool. The companies use it very selectively. It is limited. It has been secretive. We do not know the terms of this licensing. Although we are in a global pandemic, all these VLs are actually happening under a shroud of secrecy. They are restrictive and they are voluntary. That means to say the companies can say, no, we do not want to license. Even if you can manufacture, we do not want to license. Although we know you can manufacture, we do not want to license the know-how and technology. And so there is an interest here to ensure that this maintains small, the supply is artificially being constrained because it's a huge lucrative market. So this is the business as usual, and we need to get out of this business as usual approach. Another argument is IP is needed because to incentivize, this was already addressed. There's been significant public investment in R&D. These companies are making billions of dollars as a lot of the vaccines are being procured. And I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we are indeed in a health emergency. TRIPS flexibilities do exist. They are very important, as has been mentioned, but there are limitations. Compulsory license is there to address patent barriers, but it is on a case-by-case basis. It depends on how your national law has formulated it. Each country would have a separate law, separate provisions, separate procedures on how to deal with it. But what we are facing is really a global problem where we need to have a much faster, more efficient way of addressing the IP issues. There is a mechanism, this was referred to by Dimitri. There's a mechanism for compulsory licensing when it comes to countries with insufficient manufacturing capacity, but there are so many procedures attached to this mechanism. And as Dimitri has pointed out, when MSF has tried to use it, it has been extremely difficult. I think when we talk about flexibilities and often compulsory license, it's almost as if compulsory license addresses all aspects of intellectual property. No, compulsory license is for patent, but there are other IP barriers, for instance, trade secret, copyright, industrial designs, and these are not adequately addressed by the intellectual property, by compulsory licensing system. Such a system does not exist for these other aspects of intellectual property. So there are limitations in terms of scope of exceptions available. There is uncertainty as well for the other aspects of intellectual property. And so we need additional flexibilities to address these limitations. And historically, the EU has pressured developing countries not to use TRIPS flexibilities. For instance, the European Commission in its 2020 report complains of very broad, vague, arbitrary criteria that is applied for granting compulsory license in developing countries. So on the one hand, the EU now is saying you should go and use compulsory licenses. But historically, the EU has played a very important role in ensuring disincentivizing, discouraging countries from using these flexibilities. But now the EU is saying, oh, you should go and use these flexibilities. It is a very difficult situation for a lot of developing countries to be in, after almost 2 decades of being told, you should not be doing this, whenever they have tried to implement broader provisions in their national law, they have been told this is not, you should not be doing this, by different reports by the EU, by the trade agreements that the EU enters into. So just to say in the end, a lot of these issues that have been raised by the opponents to the TRIPS waiver, these issues have been addressed in significant depth by the proponents of the waiver. I've just highlighted some of, with some links, some of the papers that they have put in and all the arguments that they have made in support of the TRIPS waiver, including a paper on examples of different IP issues and barriers in COVID-19 pandemic. The proposal has received really global support from developing countries, but also civil society, trade unions, different sectors of society, because there is a recognition that we cannot be just going on with business as usual approaches. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sangeeta, for the very interesting PowerPoint presentation and your introductory remarks. And I would now invite Emmanuel Morel from the Left Group in the European Parliament to come to our debate and discussion, and maybe we together are organizing the short chat we have as availability for the remaining about 20 minutes, I think. So Emmanuel, floor is yours.
Oui, merci, merci cher Helmut, et merci aussi à nos 3 intervenants qui ont été très pertinents. Je crois que c'est très important pour nous, la gauche au Parlement européen, de se saisir de ce débat. Vous l'avez rappelé tous et toutes, l'OMC se réunit en ce moment pour se prononcer sur une proposition visant à assouplir les règles de propriété intellectuelle concernant l'accès aux vaccins contre le Covid-19. Et la proposition initiée par l'Inde et l'Afrique du Sud a recueilli beaucoup de soutien, notamment dans les pays du Sud, mais pas seulement. Et il est très troublant pour nous, citoyens européens, parlementaires européens, de voir que l'Union européenne s'associe aux États qui continuent de bloquer cette proposition. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle, avec Helmut, avec Katharina, avec d'autres députés au Parlement, nous appelons à soutenir l'initiative No Profit on Pandemic. Nous le soutenons au Parlement européen parce que nous savons que l'une des clés dans la lutte contre cette pandémie, c'est évidemment l'accès aux vaccins du plus grand nombre et au plus vite, sans quoi la pandémie fera plus de victimes et sera plus longue et plus difficile à combattre. La question, vous l'avez dit, elle n'est pas géopolitique, elle n'est pas contrainte par des grilles de lecture de type confrontation nord-sud. La question, elle doit être résolue exclusivement d'un point de vue scientifique et sanitaire. Et cela nous oblige à sortir des cadres existants pour nous élever au niveau de l'ensemble de l'humanité, parce qu'il n'y a pas d'autre cadre pour faire face de manière effective et efficace à ce virus. Il nous faut donc lever les obstacles en obligeant les entreprises pharmaceutiques à partager leurs connaissances, car c'est la seule manière de produire la quantité requise de vaccins. On le voit bien, c'est sous nos yeux, sans une mise à disposition des brevets auprès des nations, sans une transmission des procédés de fabrication et des normes de production en toute sécurité, ça ne marchera pas. Et donc, en somme, ce qui se pose, c'est la question de l'exercice de la souveraineté, notamment face aux droits de propriété. Personne ne conteste l'idée qu'il faille protéger la propriété intellectuelle, hein, et certainement pas moi, parce que je me bats tous les jours avec d'autres camarades et élus au Parlement européen pour que le vol de la propriété intellectuelle et la contrefaçon qui détruisent tant d'emplois en Europe soit contestés. Mais en l'espèce, on atteint vraiment les limites du principe. Aucun droit ne peut être exercé sans limite, de façon absolue. Et le droit de recueillir les fruits d'une invention, d'un travail d'élaboration d'une innovation médicale n'est pas plus illimité qu'autre chose. D'ailleurs, ce droit est limité dans le temps, mais là, justement, nous n'avons pas le temps. Ce qui a été possible concernant la fabrication des traitements contre le sida, sous transfert obligatoire de licence, l'est à plus forte raison concernant le Covid. Nous sommes certes face à une prouesse scientifique sans égale, ça a été dit, hein, mettre au point dans des délais si courts des vaccins contre un nouveau virus en 9 mois, ça force l'admiration, mais il ne faut jamais oublier non plus, et c'est ce qu'on dit aux entreprises qui ont travaillé hein, sur ces remèdes, c'est que ces percées scientifiques, elles sont aussi le fruit d'une mobilisation sans précédent de la puissance publique. Hein, et les firmes sont aussi redevables aux États, à la collectivité, aux citoyens qui ont mobilisé d'énormes financements publics. Et c'est grâce à l'ampleur de ces financements publics qu'on a aujourd'hui le vaccin. Donc, l'ampleur de la pandémie, dont la vitesse de propagation tient directement à l'interdépendance des nations dans la globalisation, elle nécessite aussi de partager, y compris avec des pays qui n'ont pas été en mesure de participer à ces financements. C'est pour ça que le veto de l'Union européenne à l'OMC sur les questions des brevets, elle procède finalement d'une sujétion du public au privé et du maintien envers et contre tout de ce qu'on pourrait appeler une idéologie mercantile qui rend infiniment plus difficile de faire prévaloir l'intérêt général et le bien commun, alors même qu'ils sont objectivement les seules boussoles pour sortir de la crise. Donc s'indigner et surtout réagir face à ce business as usual est d'autant plus justifié que les atteintes à la biodiversité, au réchauffement climatique font peser un risque supplémentaire de propagation de nouvelles maladies. Donc de plus, j'estime que dans ce contexte, l'attitude de la Commission européenne a été fautive. Nous pouvons en témoigner, nous, parlementaires, je vois Helmut, je vois Katharina, quand on refuse de donner au pouvoir législatif, c'est-à-dire à nous les députés, l'accès aux contrats signés avec les laboratoires, la Commission, elle se rend complice pas seulement de la captation de l'argent public par les pharma, mais aussi elle crée du trouble, elle crée de la défiance chez nos concitoyens au moment où on gère cette difficile pandémie. Donc ça pose vraiment une question très importante, à mon avis, hein, qui est celle de l'entente entre le pouvoir exécutif européen et tout un écosystème de groupes d'intérêts privés qui exigent, pour leur intérêt à eux, l'opacité sur les décisions et les contrats publics. Donc, s'il devait y avoir qu'une occasion de défendre nos valeurs européennes, ça serait maintenant. Maintenant, dans le moment où l'humanité est obligée de s'organiser collectivement contre ce fléau. C'est la raison pour laquelle, avec mes collègues ici au Parlement, mais aussi avec les citoyens, les ONG, les syndicats, partout en Europe, nous nous battons et nous nous battrons pour que les règles des brevets sur les vaccins, comme celui du Covid-19, cessent d'entraver la nécessaire et rapide immunisation d'un nombre suffisant d'habitants sur cette planète. Alors, je suis vraiment ravi que nous en débattions avec des intervenants et un panel très prestigieux. Et ensemble, parce que nous sommes résolus de jamais relâcher la pression, je suis sûr que nous obtiendrons que l'Union européenne révise sa position et rejoigne les nations qui portent courageusement ce combat pour la mise à disposition des brevets sur les vaccins contre le Covid-19. Merci à toutes et tous. Et puis maintenant, c'est les questions-réponses animées par notre ami Helmut, que je remercie encore une fois.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Danke. I will try to come to some questions I saw in the chat. First of all, I will generally answer to all the questions if we can provide the PowerPoint presentations and the other information which has been presented by our estimated key speakers. And we will ask them to provide us, and I guess that I saw already the answer from Geta that he's willing to do so, and probably also immediately will have the chance to distribute the introduction. And I hope also Professor Correa can give us this ability so that everybody can take home and to use it in the further political struggle for really dealing with this important question of giving all those countries the access to vaccines and to medicine. There was from Attila from Hungary a question. Maybe Attila, you can raise it directly. I don't hear you.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, now please speak loud.
Okay, now I think you can hear me now. Yes? Okay, hello,
Yes.
hello, everybody. I have only a very short question. In Hungary, we have an information that the European Commission has a plan to have a vaccine passport. In this passport, they are planning to input which vaccine you used or you are vaccinated. And now we have an information then that not everybody can travel in EU, only people who vaccinated not by Russian or Chinese vaccines. So it is very bad for workers, because from Hungary to a lot of workers are traveling to Austria, Germany, Slovakia because of their job. And in Hungary, a lot of people are vaccinated with Russian and Chinese vaccine. So we have a problem that all people maybe cannot travel to other countries because they are vaccinated with Russian or Chinese vaccines. Is it true? Do you know anything about this problem, or it is only a normal false fake news of media?
I can only say that I don't know much about it, to be honest. I don't know.
Dimitri, do you want?
Yeah, I can only say that I don't know. I don't know about this information about that these vaccines will be excluded from the passport. I don't know. I know the Sputnik vaccine has been requested for authorization to be entering the European market. So in that sense, if it's approved, then it will become a credible vaccine in the European Union. I'm not saying it's not a credible one, but then it will be an approved one in the European market. So it would be potentially administered and recognized in the European market. But I don't know about the link with the vaccine passport and the inability to travel. I don't have any info on that, so I just don't know.
Thank you. I will read out, maybe for practical reasons and for time reasons, further questions I saw in the question and answer. One question to Professor Correa: how can the waiver be adopted by anonymity or majority inside the WTO structures? And all the experts, do Russia and China facilitate their technologies? And as we have only left some minutes, I would ask all the three maybe to react each other on the introductory remarks which has already been made and to the questions put here in the chat.
Well, thank you, Mr. Scholz, for this question. If I understood correctly, questions about how the waiver can be adopted at the WTO. Well, as it is known, the basic rule for the governance of WTO is the consensus. So the fact that there are countries opposing to the waiver is a major obstacle because this consensus cannot be reached. It is provided for under the Constitution of WTO the possibility of votes, but it has almost never happened. So this is unlikely to be the case for the waiver. So there will be a need to get the European Union, the United States, and other countries to withdraw their support to the waiver. As it has been explained, there are many advantages as compared to the use country by country of compulsory licensing, which was also mentioned is limited mainly to patents and to granted patents, not even to patent application. So let's hope that there is a reflection on this. Just on the point of the question was made earlier by President of Hungary regarding the exclusion of the Chinese and Russian vaccines from eventually from PASPO. We also need to recognize that there are some geopolitical issues in all this process regarding the distribution of vaccines. For instance, COVAX has been mentioned. COVAX has not been able to perform its intended role, it was mentioned. And one of the reasons for this perhaps is that COVAX has a very limited portfolio. This is based only on Western companies' vaccines. They are completely overlooked the fact that the Russian vaccine is being distributed widely in many countries, as well as the Chinese vaccine. There is evidence so far of effectiveness, but this is completely excluded. And here you can find there are also geopolitical reasons that are preventing developing countries to get access to wider access to vaccine, even through COVAX because of a limited portfolio. But just this is common. I don't know exactly the situation in the European Union regarding this proposal, but I think this is something that also needs to be taken into account.
Sangeeta, Dimitri, you want to come in the round?
Generally or on a specific point?
Oh, you can choose what you want, or you can give an answer to these questions, but you can also comment other remarks already made. I would only stress the final word of Mr. Correa, Professor Correa, that probably we need the political will to do so. That we have to increase the pressure on the Commission and on the EU member states to act respectively. And that, I think, is the main challenge, also to use availabilities within the WTO frame to deal in a different way with the questions of the limited and the legal questions by the developing countries. So, and in this way, I would ask you, do you see the chance how we can come to such an increased pressure?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Schulz. I think that's a very good point. I particularly want to emphasize in what you just mentioned, your statement now, that particularly as MEPs, there's a responsibility, of course, in Brussels in addressing and questioning the European Commission. But each of us, or most of us here in the call, are also European citizens, having an active role in our own member states. And there as well, we need to have the debate around this issue. And it's quite an important issue to be addressed in the news, in debates, etc., to raise attention to this. Because what we are seeing now is that the European Commission has started to soften its tone. This has definitely come under pressure, I would even argue, from the Parliament. Last week, there was a letter that was signed by 115 MEPs calling on the EU to stop blocking the TRIPS waiver, but also from the member states. There are European Union member states that are more open to this proposal and also look at the issue from a north-south perspective and the ability to allow countries to take care of their populations, etc. In times of crisis, and that's the kind of debate that we need to have, and we need to engage it with the decision makers both in Brussels but also at capital level in our member states, because it's also the member states, not only the European Commission, it's a joint position of the European Union by the European Commission and the member states. So they also need to engage with this debate with the European Commission to ask them to stop blocking this proposal. And a final point on this, it's important as well at the EU level that even if the EU does not want to use the TRIPS waiver, they can still allow other countries to do so. It's not one waiver for the whole world. Each country can choose if it wants to apply the waiver or not. So there is definitely a possibility to allow other countries that are not EU member states to allow the application of the waiver, while the EU itself does not apply the waiver as such.
Sangeeta?
Yeah, I could come in and say that I think, just to echo Dimitri, I think there is a bit of a disconnect. I always found the European Commission and the statements it was making in WTO kind of a disconnect with actually what is happening on the ground in reality, and the supply shortages that even European countries are facing. Yeah. And I think there is a need to engage at the national level and to persist different routes to get the European Commission to understand the gravity of the global challenges we are facing. Sometimes the statements you see by the European Commission, they do not seem to comprehend the global health emergency that we are facing from COVID-19 and from the mutations. We are hearing new variants, and countries are taking measures that were unheard of, lockdowns, privatization, that were unprecedented before. And so we cannot approach access through, the business as usual approach. We have to be more bold and take on and address this barrier upfront. And this is the one situation where it is very clear we need to publicly share the technology know-how and lift any kind of intellectual monopoly around it. And I think that call has to come from member states of the EU, calling on the Commission to really reconsider its position that it is taking at the WTO. In terms of vaccine passports, this is an issue that is coming up, but given the fact that large parts of the world do not have access to vaccines, I think this situation tends to create more inequity globally. If you look from a global perspective, I'm not going to comment so much at the EU level, but you look at global perspective, I think between those who have been vaccinated and then the large parts of the world that have not been vaccinated, and this is going to continue. I think I saw at some of the news reports saying at the rate of vaccination, current rate of vaccination, it will take 5 years, 6 years, 7 years for the world population to be vaccinated. And here we are also facing this issue of where populations that have been vaccinated will have to be revaccinated, because as more effective vaccines come on the market, there are new variants, vaccines are being updated. So we are going to face huge supply issues for a number of years a number of years in the future. And I think we really need to take really bold steps to address that. I see some questions are there on implementation. I think these are issues that need to be addressed in text-based negotiations, but these are the exact negotiations that the EU is opposing in the WTO. And I think a lot of the issues around implementation, the proponents have actually explained that it's really up to countries to decide how to implement it nationally. And as Dimitri has mentioned, if a country decides it does not want to use the waiver, that's also okay. This is an additional policy option that is being made available to countries, which can actually bring a lot of the developing countries together to collaborate and to expand supply. And that can also benefit supply for developed countries as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, the time is elapsing and we have to organize to give over the order to the next panel, which is probably, of course, continuing the whole debate and the questions we have just started to discuss the whole day and the conference. And I want to thank also here Katerina Konechna for organizing this conference in the name of the left group in the European Parliament. And probably we will come back to the one or the other aspect of the discussion we started now later on. But I don't know exactly if Claire is with us because she wanted to make the conclusion of this round of the first panel. I can't see her. So she is probably not here with us. So I will make then a short summary. I want to thank all the speakers, Sanjeta, Dimitri, and Carlos, if you allow that I call you by your surnames. And in this way, I hope that it's clear that the struggle for dealing with the global aspect of fighting together the pandemic means that we must develop a political will to pressure on the executive in the countries as well as in the European Union and, of course, their representatives in the international organizations to do so and to use all availabilities to make it possible that in the short time we have to go into the direction using the waiver, use the flexibility, but of course in a certain way to use also the political pressure to rethink the question of how health as a public good should be incorporated into the legal and constitutional legislation of our country. And by that, to create the precondition for fighting successfully also such pandemics. Because maybe that is the first pandemic we are experiencing in a lifetime, but probably it will be not the last one. And so we have to link to other debates, discussions we lead in other fields of our policies carried out in the economics, in the social aspects, in the political aspects, and in particular under the challenges of climate change and fighting and mitigating the loss of biodiversity. It is very important to see with a different eye on the question of how we can make sure that health as a public good, also as a right of any human being, for getting the right to get certain answers from the political structure to satisfy it as a current challenge of political struggles within the European Union. And therefore, I thank you for the very important introductory remarks. And finally, I will say what we discussed: the vaccines, the medicines, medical products are not goods as good, but they are public goods, and we have to take care that the public goods belongs to everybody.
Thank you.
So, and I would switch then, give over the next panel 2, and probably that is then responsible by Miguel Orban. I want to thank the interpreters for their very intense work. As foreseen, we have now, I think, 20 minutes, 25 minutes break, and then the second panel. Thank you very much for the help, and all the best to you.
You can activate it on the down part of your screen. You should be able to see it right here. If you don't see the languages that you see now on the screen, it means your Zoom needs to be updated. You can do that on the main. You should be able to see it here. How do you update Zoom? That's only in the case that you don't see the languages that are, and you need them, of course, that you see on the other screen. That's it, Miguel, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Olivier. Bueno, lo primero quería dar la bienvenida a todos y a todas, especialmente a las panelistas que van a estar en este segundo panel de las jornadas Las vacunas, un bien común para la humanidad, organizada desde la izquierda europea. En este panel vamos a hablar del acceso justo y global a las vacunas. También, antes de empezar, quería agradecer el trabajo invisible que hay detrás de la organización de estas jornadas. Yo soy Miguel Urbán, miembro de la izquierda en el Parlamento Europeo y de Anticapitalistas en el Estado español. Me gustaría, antes de presentar a las panelistas que nos acompañarán ahora, hacer unas apreciaciones o por lo menos unos elementos que marquen también el debate. Este mes de marzo, justamente, vamos a cumplir un año en Europa de confinamientos, de estados de alarma, de dolor, de muertes, de crisis múltiples y, en cierta medida, se habla de un año que lo cambió todo. Y es cierto que hemos vivido fenómenos que no nos hubiésemos imaginado meses atrás y que buena parte de nuestra realidad ha mutado. Si nos hubieran preguntado en el 2019 lo que iba a pasar en el 2020, yo creo que nadie hubiera acertado. Pero no nos equivoquemos. La pandemia, sobre todo, ha acelerado y ha profundizado dinámicas que venían de lejos, pero también ha roto muchos consensos y creencias neoliberales. Hemos visto cómo en Europa las reglas del gasto han sido suspendidas porque ha quedado palpable que la austeridad no sirve para hacer frente a los desafíos de nuestro tiempo. Hemos comprobado el efecto que tiene en nuestra salud décadas de recortes neoliberales en la sanidad y en servicios públicos. Hemos visto cómo la desindustrialización de Europa se mostró con toda su crudeza cuando la población comprobó que ya no se producían ni mascarillas, ni respiradores, ni prácticamente nada de lo necesario para afrontar una pandemia como esta. Y en el caso concreto del que hablamos hoy, las vacunas, comprobamos cómo el desorden global neoliberal es incompatible con cualquier fórmula de gobernanza mundial que asegure una campaña de vacunación planetaria, universal o al menos mínimamente coordinada. Mientras tanto, la ley del mercado ha entregado a las empresas farmacéuticas la llave de la supuesta salvación sin pedirles nada a cambio. A día de hoy, comprobamos cómo el 95% de las dosis han sido repartidas y aplicadas en países de altos ingresos. De hecho, recientemente hemos sabido que en mayo del año pasado, investigadores de la Universidad de Helsinki habían desarrollado una vacuna contra el coronavirus libre de patentes, pero nadie, ni el gobierno finlandés, ni ningún otro Estado miembro o las propias instituciones europeas aprovecharon esta oportunidad. Sin embargo, se pusieron en manos de las farmacéuticas privadas que solo ahora, muchos meses después, están empezando a suministrar vacunas, muchas veces con retrasos y en volúmenes muy inferiores a los justamente acordados. Una especie de fe ciega en el mercado, una fe ciega en lo privado, que no solo es irracional, sino que además, como estamos comprobando, cuesta vidas. Y en este caso muestra por enésima vez una falacia que estamos escuchando a menudo, y es que los derechos de propiedad intelectual son necesarios para fomentar la innovación sin el cual no avanzaría el mundo. Pero en este caso vemos como la apuesta por la iniciativa privada y sus patentes privativas están llegando más tarde de lo posible y de una forma profundamente injusta. Y se ha demostrado cómo los derechos de propiedad intelectual forman parte de una arquitectura legal al servicio de los intereses privados y que esa ley del mercado solo tiene una norma: obtener el máximo beneficio. Solo desde esa fe ciega de la que hablábamos en el mercado se puede asumir la total dependencia que conlleva dejar en manos de multinacionales la producción y suministro de un bien básico como las vacunas. La iniciativa de COVAX es parte de esta fe ciega en el mercado. Podría resultar a primera vista como un parche de caridad de los países ricos y de las multinacionales hacia los países del sur, con todo lo negativo que conocemos de las iniciativas caritativas, su naturaleza vertical, su refuerzo de las relaciones de dependencia norte-sur y que en ningún momento cuestiona el orden injusto. Pero hay que decir que COVAX es aún peor, porque plantea una nueva gobernanza a la OMC en donde un puñado de países y multinacionales deciden cuántas vacunas reciben y qué países las reciben. Es paradójico que llevemos años criticando lo antidemocrático de la OMC y que su alternativa sea aún algo peor. Lo que demuestra que lejos de vislumbrar un horizonte antineoliberal, podemos asistir a una especie de aceleración neoliberal utilizando la crisis como una coartada para llevar a cabo reformas que agraven aún más la situación social, pero que beneficien a una minoría peligrosa y que refuercen sus posiciones de privilegio, que eso es lo que estamos viendo justamente ahora. Por eso no solo tenemos que ir más allá de COVAX, como dice el título de este panel, sino que debemos de abordar, y aquí esto es un elemento que para nosotros es fundamental, abordar la verdadera cuestión de fondo, que es la propiedad privada. Y esa propiedad privada debe desaparecer como concepto y práctica en asuntos ligados con la vida. La gestión de la pandemia es el enésimo reflejo del conflicto de fondo entre capital y vida, entre intereses privados y bienes comunes, entre mercancías y derechos. Si tenemos que sacar algo positivo de esta crisis, que sea la constatación general de esta incompatibilidad central entre capital y vida. La provisión de un bien público no puede defender canales privados ni la voluntariedad de nadie. Hay que liberar las patentes y desarrollar capacidades productivas propias, locales cuando sea posible y compensando con solidaridad internacional cuando no lo sea. Si la vacunación, como parte fundamental del acceso a la salud, es un derecho humano, las vacunas deben de ser entendidas como un bien público. Y entonces tenemos que adjuntar un adjetivo, que es el de global, un bien público global. De lo contrario, estaremos no solo ante una solución injusta, inmoral e insolidaria, sino también ante un sinsentido absoluto en términos sanitarios. No nos perdamos en trampas normativas. Es cierto que hay cláusulas en la OMC, en el Tratado de Funcionamiento de la Unión Europea o en las leyes de muchos países miembros que permiten suspender estas licencias de propiedad intelectual. Pero esto no va justamente de leyes, sino de voluntad política. Cuando ha habido que rescatar a bancos o a grandes empresas, los poderosos no han escatimado en recursos, ni en tiempo, ni en lo que decían las leyes para salvarlos. El capitalismo no está preparado para hacer frente a los desafíos de nuestro tiempo, ni su gobernanza, ni sus estructuras, ni sus principales actores, las empresas multinacionales. Cuando solo rige la ley del mercado, los derechos se vuelven mercancías, la salud un negocio y la vida un número en una cuenta de resultados. Por eso, defender los bienes comunes implica atreverse a cuestionar el santuario de la propiedad privada para poder construir un espacio público en expansión, sin el cual los mismos derechos democráticos estarán condenados a desaparecer. No quiero ocupar más espacio a las ponentes, que son las verdaderas protagonistas de este panel, 3 mujeres de 3 continentes, todas procedentes de espacios políticos, sociales y sindicales, protagonistas del sur, para hablar del sur, un enfoque tricontinental tan necesario en estos momentos. Cada una tendrá 15 minutos para presentar su visión y propuestas. Disculpar por mi mala pronunciación de sus nombres y apellidos. En primer lugar tendremos a Levolán Mulasi, miembro de la Confederación de COSATU, la Confederación de Sindicatos de Sudáfrica. Beni Curubilla, coordinadora para el sur de Asia de la organización Focus on the Global South. Y por último, Fernanda Milchona de Silva, diputada federal por el PSOL en el Parlamento brasileño. Luego, después tendremos unos minutos de debate y un cierre por parte de las ponencias. Y por último, Manu Aubry, copresidenta de la izquierda, cerrará las jornadas por hoy. Sin más, quería dar las gracias y pasarle la palabra a Levolán. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you for your very useful introduction. I think you've painted a clear picture of what is happening with regards to the distribution as well as acquisition of vaccines for the rest of the global South. Let me begin my inputs by just giving a brief introductory remarks on the context of South Africa and our position as the trade union movement. So as an introduction, the COVID pandemic that has now spread worldwide has had a significant impact on the economies of many countries. Analysts predict a global recession worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s, as economies worldwide shrink while countries battle to trade due to heavy lockdowns in order to constrain the spread of the virus. The virus places significant pressures on public health facilities, and this has been the case for South Africa, as patients require hospitalization and expensive ventilators for treatment. In an effort to prevent the transmission of disease, countries have resorted to flatten the curve through lockdowns, completely halting economic activities through the restriction of movement, trade, as well as the prohibition of public gatherings. Global economies have been turned upside down, with the most developed economies reporting a spike in the levels of unemployment and poverty. Very little, and probably everyone, has not been left unscathed by the virus. All countries, all economies, and all workers have been impacted. South Africa's economic outlook prior to the COVID-19 pandemic was already depressed, with a technical recession and a rating of sub-investment grade by the main ratings agencies. The lockdown, accompanied by a ratings downgrade, has posed serious challenges for the South African economy, its workers and the poor, and its ability to cushion citizens from the hardship as imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Currently, we sit with an unemployment rate at a record high of 32.5%. The expanded definition, which includes discouraged work seekers, is set at 42%. The plight of the poor and the working class is set to worsen. The first wave of the pandemic has had a devastating and long-lasting impact on the economy. Studies show that at least 3 million people have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. The overall economic performance of the country has worsened. GDP has declined significantly. The budget deficit has increased significantly, almost 90% of GDP, and tax revenues have plummeted. The second wave, which has proven to be more severe than the first, as cases of COVID infections reach record levels, with healthcare workers in both the public and private healthcare facilities heavily infected and visibly overstretched. South Africa began rolling out its vaccines and the vaccine plan from the 1st of February 2021. To date, South Africa has been able to secure 80,000 doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, primarily for healthcare workers on the front line in the first wave, in the first phase of the vaccine distribution. The second phase will begin to inoculate the broader majority of at-risk groups. This is all largely dependent on the availability of vaccines. Because of the big spending power of most Western and European nations, the Global South has been pushed to the back of the queue when it comes to the acquisition of vaccines. Inequality and greed has reared its ugly head again, as the Global North begin to hoard vaccines, just like they did with personal protective equipment when this crisis began, procuring more than their countries need while thousands lose their lives here in the Global South due to the virus. Other than a few utterances from multinational or multilateral organizations, the silence from the rest of the world has been deafening, while each country begins their bid for self-preservation. In the midst of the scramble for vaccines in the interest of national interests, there is a real risk that this national vaccine drive will not reach undocumented migrant workers as they fall through the cracks. Migrant laborers are often in already precarious work arrangements, and seeking out a vaccine for themselves or their family members could subject them to victimization, harassment, discrimination, and even ultimately deportation. Globalization is underpinned around the principles of international trade, foreign direct investment, capital market flows, migration, as well as the diffusion of technology, all of which will ultimately become constrained if there is severe inequality in the way vaccines are rolled out around the world. Vaccines should be a global initiative instead of a national initiative like we have seen across the world. From the Global South, we are hoping for greater advocacy amongst our partners in the Global North to bring about the stop in the scourge for the hoarding of vaccines so that there's greater inequality, there is greater equality in the way that vaccines are being distributed. Thank you, moderator.
Muchas gracias. Le pasamos a Beni, que disculpar, me habían comentado que era directora, es director. Le pasamos la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to speak at this very important strategic initiative of the left group in the European Parliament on Beyond COVAX. You know, COVAX was set up in June 2020 with the intent to ensure speedy and equitable access to vaccines and protect the most vulnerable people across the world. I would like to submit that, linked to some of the points that Miguel made, that despite its noble sounding intentions, COVAX is a fundamentally flawed, undemocratic vehicle, and it is not the appropriate vehicle for ensuring universal access to vaccines. It will not be able to deliver at the speed, at the scale, and at the prices that are urgently required if we are to bring the pandemic under control or to end it in the foreseeable future. And I will start by highlighting 4 reasons as to why COVAX is flawed. For one, it is not an intergovernmental multilateral process. Rather, it is a multi-stakeholder initiative or a public-private partnership where its decision-making and negotiations are not transparent. It does not have adequate participation of much of the developing countries who are part of it. It's instead led by a few donor countries, the private sector, and foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with arguably a marginal role for the World Health Organization. In fact, this concern of the sidelining of the WHO was raised as early as October 2020, when a number of countries, including Kenya, Austria, Romania, and the United Kingdom, asked the WHO to assume a greater role in governance decisions of COVAX. Secondly, COVAX aims to get access to vaccines for up to 190 countries. And latest reports indicate that it is struggling to scale up supply of the few odd vaccines that it's mandated for supply. And the money is just not there as well. And just to give you a sense of the vaccine numbers, as many of you know, developed countries are expecting to vaccinate some 70% of their populations by the summer of 2021, whereas the latest COVAX interim projections for Q1 and Q2 of this year, so by June of 2021, they expect only 3.3% of the population in 145 countries. And just to remind you that the COVAX goal itself for 2021 is only 20% of the population of its member countries. Now, the third problem with COVAX is that most of the rich countries that are part of it are also securing bilateral deals with pharma companies. And I guess Europe is a classic case in point. And this has also impacted the volumes that are coming into COVAX, also the interest of manufacturers to get into the COVAX project. For example, out of the 244 million doses that have been globally administered as of yesterday, March 1st, more than 80% were in 10 countries. Most of them were rich countries, and most of it financed bilaterally with companies outside of the COVAX facility. While the first vaccine doses started in sort of early December 2020 in Russia and the UK, The first jabs of COVAX reached Africa, the Ivory Coast, only yesterday, nearly 3 months later. And as we speak, almost half the world's countries haven't been able to vaccinate even a single person in their populations. My fourth point about COVAX is that through its complex financial arrangements, COVAX primarily intends to protect the commercial interests of big pharma. Its finance includes large donations from countries like France, Germany, funds from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, loans from the European Investment Bank, a vaccine bond loan from the International Finance Facility for immunization. So this entanglement of various financial actors essentially means that COVAX behaves increasingly like a financial intermediary and takes decisions based on commercial interests in terms of which firms get the contracts, etc. And as with other bonds and loans, the money needs to be paid back to the IFFIM and other investors who are part of COVAX. And it is these commercial considerations that ensure that even as the deputy CEO of Gavi, who's a former Indian bureaucrat of Gavi that is coordinating COVAX, he recently made a statement to the Indian media that it's very evident that demand for COVID vaccines in 2021 will far exceed supply. Gavi has not said anything about the TRIPS waiver proposal that was discussed in detail in the last panel. So, my point is, therefore, it's quite evident what COVAX cannot achieve and what the problems with it are. But what can the TRIPS waiver achieve what COVAX cannot? And I think we need to underline that, for one, it will allow developing country manufacturers to quickly upscale production of vaccines and related medical products without being restricted by the IP rules. And the scaling up of manufacturing can also make vaccines cheaper. And interestingly, data from this comes from CEPI, which is a Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which is also one of the leaders of COVAX. When they did a survey last year in October, they found there was potential global production capacity in more than 113 facilities across the world. And these are just firms that responded to this survey. And the CEPI survey was done recognizing that there's a great imminent risk in a few countries monopolizing global vaccine supply. We've seen that happen in the last few months. And therefore, that monopolizing will limit the supply of vaccines to those that need it the most. And not just the CEPI survey, but reports in many countries, in India, in South Africa, surveys have shown that there's a bunch of developing countries. So India, Brazil, South Africa, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, all of these countries have facilities with proven capacity to produce safe and effective vaccines with government supervision. But they are unable to utilize these production capacities due to IP barriers. There's a network called the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturing Network, the DCVMN, which is comprised of 41 members, including the world's largest vaccine maker, the Serum Institute of India. And pre the pandemic, they'd already supplied 3.5 billion vaccines annually across the globe. And considering the challenge of COVID mutations, the likelihood of more endemic outbreaks in the future, it's imperative that we need more manufacturers and not rely on a few, as is the current case. And to sort of conclude, COVAX is clearly a step in the wrong direction. It's a classic case of multilateral bodies and governments standing aside and allowing a few large donors and private actors to set the rules of the pandemic response. And so far, it's been an abject failure. But if not COVAX, then what? And given the urgency to meet the demands on equitable access, it's evident that the World Health Organization must show greater leadership. And to enable this leadership, it needs to be better funded. The assessed contributions to the WHO should increase urgently. The crisis of the pandemic has presented us, the global community, with an important moment to reclaim democratic multilateralism. And that's been in a crisis across fora, right? It's been a crisis at the climate forums, at the UNFCCC. There's been a crisis of the WTO. You know, this is an opportunity for governments to assume control on sort of decision-making to advance the public interest. And for groups like ours, our focus is based in Asia. We work in 4 countries with a network of regional groups, of various global groups. We believe that the way forward includes the immediate approval of the WTO waiver proposal on intellectual property rights. There should be a follow-up with an immediate international collaborative, cooperative process for the production and distribution of vaccines, which can be overseen by the World Health Assembly. I mean, just to underline that we're in the middle of an extraordinary crisis that requires extraordinary responses and not business as usual responses as propounded by the opponents of the TRIPS waiver. So let me just end by congratulating the 118 members of the European Parliament who, by calling on the European Union to support the TRIPS waiver, chose to be on the right side of history. And thank you for organizing this panel. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Benny. Yo me quedo con 2 cosas que comentabas, ¿no? COVAX es un paso en la dirección equivocada y sobre todo que está siendo un fracaso. Ahora tendría que hablar Fernanda Melchiona, pero hemos tenido un problema logístico y estamos viendo que se pueda conectar, con lo cual estaba pidiendo la palabra Brit Brennan del TNI. Si queréis le podemos dar un momento la palabra mientras solucionamos los problemas técnicos con Fernanda. No sé si Brit ¿querías comentar algo, Brit, del Transnational Institute?
Sí, hola. Hola, Miguel.
Yes, Brit, but it's not possible. Can you hear?
Yes, I can hear. I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
No, just
thank you, Brit.
No, very briefly. I wanted to flag up with you, the panelists, but also with the participants, that there is ongoing a multi-sectoral campaign where many movements and organizations, the People's Health Movement, Public Services International, focus on the Global South, which from Benny, also TNI, Friends of the Earth International. Many organizations are campaigning jointly on the COVAX question, and I will post in the chat the link for that information, because I think it's really very important to carry the excellent inputs that you've had here at the webinar to the level of the campaigners, and also to see where we can go forward together. We are very interested in developing that together with you in the left in the European Parliament. So thank you.
Muchas gracias, Brit. La verdad es que es impresionante una cuestión que yo mencionaba al principio de la intervención, que es esa especie de fe ciega en el mercado. Una fe ciega porque se ha mostrado totalmente incompetente, inoperante para poder solventar la crisis ante la que nos encontramos, ¿no? Y sobre todo, incluso una fe ciega que en el debate que pudimos tener de nuestro grupo parlamentario con la presidenta de la Comisión, Ursula von der Leyen, ella misma reconocía que era tan ciega esa fe que ni siquiera los contratos con las multinacionales eran públicos y nos pedía a los eurodiputados y eurodiputadas de nuestro grupo que presionáramos para que se hicieran públicos, para que fueran transparentes, ¿no? Yo creo que una iniciativa que ni siquiera puede tener elementos de transparencia mínimos y básicos, que es como conocer las cláusulas de los contratos, yo creo que muestra la ineficacia clara y sobre todo llama la atención que tienen que esconder justamente en este tipo de contratos. Y sobre todo el dato que mostrábamos, ¿no? Cómo el 95% de las dosis actualmente están o las han acaparado los países más ricos del planeta, acrecentando esas líneas de desigualdad norte-sur que ya eran verdaderamente dramáticas antes de la pandemia, y por eso hablamos de que el coronavirus no es que haya traído nuevas crisis simplemente, sino que sobre todo ha acelerado procesos que ya estábamos viendo, ¿no? Y yo creo que parte de esa aceleración de procesos que van contra lógicas también multilaterales es la propia COVAX, ¿no? Y yo creo que esto es un elemento central. Yo no sé si Levolán podría abordar un poquito más hasta que entre Fernanda en las propuestas que se han hecho, por ejemplo, desde Sudáfrica, desde los movimientos sociales, con la cuestión de la liberalización de las patentes. Si no, yo creo que en 2 minutos tendremos a Fernanda con nosotros, pero no sé si Levolán quiere abordar y ahondar un poco más sobre la propuesta que han hecho, por ejemplo, desde Sudáfrica en ese sentido.
Thank you, moderator. So maybe you've heard, you know, some of the proposals coming from South Africa. You know, we're an emerging economy, a third world nation. So clearly we're not able to develop vaccines as quickly as what the rest of the world has been able to do. And that's probably why we've fallen so far behind when it comes to issues of, you know, developing a vaccine ourselves, acquiring one and distributing it to the broad population. So ours has always been that, you know, we should share and there should be greater liberalization of patents shared to various nations. And really the idea around this is to enhance access to vaccines. You know, and at the core of this is, you know, it's counterproductive to have a small portion of the population vaccinated from this virus. When it continues to mutate and there are variants over variants, and to us, it's completely counterproductive, and it limits access to much needed vaccination to the greater African population. Ideally, you know, even going into this COVAX facility, there really shouldn't have been an opportunity to profiteer from this whole process. When you consider the devastating impacts that this virus has had on economies, on people's livelihoods, on the poor, on the working class, there really should not have been, we shouldn't have treated this facility as a business transaction. It's starting to look very much like a business transaction, as though we are not prioritizing people's right to life. I don't know about the rest of the world, but in the South African Constitution, the right to life is enshrined in the Constitution. So we should have, and this is why we thought multilateralism would have played a greater part in ensuring that we treat this very important product as a public good instead of a financial transaction. So these are the proposals that have been coming from South Africa. You've probably heard some of the utterances from our president in the AU as he currently chairs it. You know that these need to be greatly liberalized so that African countries can begin to develop vaccines themselves. You know, the funny thing is that certain vaccines are tested and developed in South Africa, shipped elsewhere for acquisition elsewhere. while South Africans don't have access to vaccines. I think that is a big indictment to the progress that we've made in multilateralism so far. So I don't know, moderator, if I answered your question quite accurately, but these have been most of our, disappointments especially from the global north. We've had great partnerships and we've worked well on various programs. The HIV and AIDS program that was rolled out in South Africa, we were hardest hit by that pandemic. And we've worked so well across nations, even though there's been a bit of capitalism and a lot of things that have happened in that process. But I think what has happened with the COVAX facilities and acquisitions to vaccines have completely shocked us, and I think have taken us, 10 steps backwards in our relationship with the rest of the world, which we're hoping to restore in the future so that we can enhance access moving forward.
Muchas gracias, Legoland. Solo como había un dato hoy que salía en la prensa que me parecía brutal, ¿no? Que es Francia y Alemania habían propuesto enviar 13 millones de dosis de vacunas a diferentes países africanos. Un dato totalmente irrisorio de vacunas. Pero es que no solo era una cifra insuficiente, sino que, por ejemplo, el nuevo presidente italiano del gobierno tecnocrático que ahora mismo ha llegado a Italia, el ex banquero Draghi, ha dicho que ni siquiera quería oír hablar del envío de esas 13 millones a países africanos, lo cual muestra no solo ese elemento de insolidaridad, sino también, sobre todo, cómo está siendo verdaderamente un fracaso esta iniciativa. Creo que ya tenemos a Fernanda con nosotros y nosotras. Fernanda, Fernanda Menchona, diputada del PSOL en Brasil. No sé si estás conectada, Fernanda.
Oi, bom dia, Miguel. Bom dia a todos e todas. Posso falar em português?
Sí, Fernanda, sin problemas. Hay traducción.
No, hablo em espanhol, portunhol. É um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Quero cumprimentar a iniciativa de nosso companheiro Miguel Urbán, que é muito ativista, muito envolvido na luta internacionalista, e esse debate, de fato, é o debate mundial agora, né? Que é o tema das vacinas. Primeiro, queria dar um quadro da situação no Brasil, porque aqui é evidente que o vírus, o Covid-19, esgaçou ou aumentou as desigualdades já do capitalismo, né? Tanto é que o vírus ele é muito, mas muito mais letal na população mais pobre. Nós temos uma pesquisa aqui, Miguel, que um jovem de um bairro chamado Paraisópolis, que é um dos bairros que moram mais pobres, negros em São Paulo, tem 10 chances a mais de morrer de Covid-19 que um jovem dos bairros ricos da capital de São Paulo. Isso é expressão, né, de que o coronavírus não causou as desigualdades, mas, na verdade, demonstrou na prática como funciona o capitalismo na hora do acesso aos serviços públicos, porque é evidente que sem o sistema público de saúde aqui mais gente teria morrido, mas a maioria dos que morreram, a ampla maioria, são trabalhadores, negros, indígenas, que a imunidade dos indígenas ainda tem pesquisas das universidades comprovando que é maior em relação aos riscos de morrer de coronavírus, e ao mesmo tempo que a gente vê essa esperança que é a vacina mundialmente, tem o tema das patentes, que é muito importante, eu quero falar um pouquinho sobre a situação na América Latina, e nós vivemos aqui o vírus da extrema-direita, que é muito grave, que é o negacionismo, que é o obscurantismo, que é um passo ainda anterior à luta pelo acesso e aquisição das vacinas, né? O Brasil hoje é o segundo país do mundo que mais gente morreu por Covid-19. Nós temos 253 mil mortos de Covid-19. E agora, há um ano depois do início da pandemia, o Brasil vive a pior crise. São 15 estados entrando em colapso do sistema de saúde. Vocês sabem que o Brasil é um país continental, enorme, né, com vários estados e com várias diferenças regionais. E no início do ano, nós estamos vivendo 15 estados com os sistemas públicos de saúde colapsando. Começamos o ano em Manaus, que é no norte do país, com pessoas morrendo sem oxigênio. Sem oxigênio, Miguel. Não é que as pessoas tinham Covid e não iam sobreviver. Morreram porque o sistema público de saúde foi incapaz de garantir oxigênio. Morreram sem ar. E o pior de tudo isso, o Ministério da Saúde do governo Bolsonaro sabia da falta de oxigênio e não garantiu oxigênio para Manaus. Ficou insistindo com um tratamento precoce que a extrema-direita, eu não sei como é que é na Espanha, até gostaria de ouvir de vocês, mas a extrema-direita aqui insistiu que seria a solução para o Covid, que é a cloroquina, que não funciona. As pesquisas científicas mostram que aumenta a incidência de morte. E eles seguem, um ano depois, insistindo com a cloroquina. Passado um mês da crise de Manaus, essa crise se espalha por vários lugares do país. Eu mesma perdi agora o irmão de um amigo de 40 anos, sem nenhuma comorbidade, morreu por falta de leito em Porto Alegre. Isso tem aumentado no Brasil. Além disso, nós começamos o ano com o aumento da crise econômica, né? O Brasil é um dos países mais desiguais do mundo. Nós temos 1% da população que tem 50% de toda a renda. Durante a pandemia, a crise econômica se aumentou, é óbvio, e o auxílio emergencial, que foi aquele ajuda financeira para as famílias de baixa renda, acabou no início do ano. Hoje nós temos 20 milhões de brasileiros na extrema pobreza, 20 milhões de brasileiros na extrema pobreza. Então, a situação já é grave, gravíssima, né? Somado com isso, nós temos um presidente negacionista que passou a pandemia inteira negando o vírus. Ontem, não, anteontem, o Bolsonaro estava fazendo política contra a máscara, contra o uso de máscara, gente. Contra o uso de máscara. Imagine. Contra o uso de máscara. É inadmissível. E nós, né, embora tenha uma questão muito importante que o debate traz, nós estamos vivendo uma guerra, né, uma corrida pelas vacinas e, ao mesmo tempo, de novo, a concentração nas mãos das grandes farmacêuticas, que é o caso da Pfizer, né, da Johnson & Johnson, e a centralização faz com que eles estipulem os preços que quiserem, é óbvio, faz com que, obviamente, os países ricos tenham mais condições na aquisição das vacinas e tem essa barbaridade, que é a dificuldade de acesso para os países do terceiro mundo, ou os países em desenvolvimento, como eles nos chamam, né? Nós aqui na América Latina só temos o Chile, que tem uma boa capacidade de vacinação, vacinou bastante da população. A Argentina não conseguiu doses suficientes, e vocês sabem, não tem um presidente negacionista. O Uruguai não conseguiu começar, de fato, a campanha de vacinação com a rapidez que precisa. O México está com dificuldade de acesso à vacina, porque é evidente, tem o COVAX, que foi feito pela Organização Mundial da Saúde, que seria um consórcio para aquisição das vacinas, que se mostrou fracassado, porque na economia do capitalismo, né, é um insumo, não vai ficar nas mãos da Organização Mundial de Saúde para distribuir de forma igual para os países que mais precisam, quando, na verdade, a Pfizer ganha bastante, tendo cláusulas que são cláusulas pesadas com os países que vendem a vacina. Evidente que a prioridade é salvar vidas, então é óbvio que os países vão fazer essa corrida. E no caso da China, que tem o Coronavac, né? Pelo menos aqui tem um desenvolvimento com o Butantan, a China, a Índia, eles centralizam o IFA, que é os insumos para que os países que têm termo de cooperação possam produzir as suas vacinas, o que também entra dentro de uma lógica de geopolítica mundial, né? E, obviamente, dificulta o acesso dos países ao desenvolvimento da vacina. Então, eu acho que uma luta internacional de todos nós é a quebra das patentes. Numa situação de emergência, quer dizer, Numa situação em que a vida esteja acima do lucro e que as relações de solidariedade estejam acima das relações do capital, é evidente, né, que a gente deveria ter outra relação de cooperação entre os países. Numa situação ainda mais grave, em relação ao impacto do Covid-19 na vida das pessoas, que já matou milhões de pessoas Brasil afora, é evidente que a quebra das patentes é uma urgência para que cada país possa usar os seus parques tecnológicos e desenvolver a vacina, que é a única arma capaz de salvar vidas nesse momento. E é uma luta que vocês podem contar comigo, né, Miguel? Se quiser fazer declaração dos deputados, a gente envolve os deputados do Parla Sul, porque é um problema para todo o mundo, sobretudo, né, para a América Latina, para a África, para os países. E mesmo na Europa, as campanhas de vacinação ainda não estão com a dimensão que deveriam, né? Diante dessa corrida das vacinas. Então, evidentemente, essa luta é a luta número 0 em termos globais, para que a gente possa desenvolver a vacina e salvar vidas. E para nós, aqui no Brasil, tem a luta -1, a luta anterior a isso, ou junto com isso, que é a luta contra a extrema-direita. Eu quero agradecer aqui pessoalmente nesse webinário o Miguel Urbán, que foi um dos principais aliados, né, das nossas declarações contra o obscurantismo do Bolsonaro. Nós não temos dúvida que é uma medida sanitária derrotar a extrema-direita no Brasil. Não é possível o que nós estamos vivendo aqui. E não é que o Bolsonaro nega a ciência só, ele foi um entrave para a aquisição de vacinas. Para vocês terem uma ideia, quando o Ministério da Saúde negociou, né, com a China o desenvolvimento da pesquisa essa da vacina chinesa, que tem um parque tecnológico chamado Butantan, com servidores públicos aqui, que começou a desenvolver a vacina, o Bolsonaro fez o Ministério da Saúde descumprir, desassinar ou enfim, não fazer este acordo, porque a vacina era da China. Porque as pessoas que tomariam a vacina teriam um chip para virar comunistas ou qualquer coisa que o valha. Ele chegou a dizer que as pessoas virariam um jacaré. Então, além de criar uma desconfiança com a vacina, com a ciência, com a máscara, além de fazer política permanente para ter aglomerações, porque ele diz que não pode parar, o Brasil deveria fazer lockdown integral agora, porque é o pior momento da pandemia no nosso país. Ele tem ido nos estados, promovido aglomeração, atacado os governadores. Além de tudo isso, ele boicotou deliberadamente o acesso à vacina. E é óbvio, a gente sabe que essa extrema-direita é negacionista e que ela precisa ser derrotada historicamente. E nós estamos nessa luta contra a extrema-direita, mas enquanto o Bolsonaro segue governando o país, pior é para a vida dos brasileiros. A gente perdeu 1.582 pessoas dia 25 de fevereiro. O pior momento da pandemia, o colapso nos sistemas públicos de saúde. A nossa vacinação está em menos de 4% da população, muito fruto do empenho dos servidores de carreira e dos governos, né, de outros governos regionais e não do governo federal. E, ao mesmo tempo que ele segue promovendo um festival de fake news, liberando armas. Ele está liberando armas em meio à pandemia, gente, com o aumento dos feminicídios, com o aumento dos assassinatos das mulheres. Está querendo fazer projeto de mineração em terra indígena. Acabou de aprovar a autonomia do Banco Central para entregar para o sistema financeiro o controle do Banco Central, da política fiscal do país no meio da pandemia. Faz chantagem com a vida, porque está condicionando o auxílio emergencial com agenda de ajuste fiscal, de rebaixamento global de salários da classe trabalhadora. Então, eu quero agradecer o apoio dos deputados do Parlamento Europeu, sobretudo do Miguel Urbán, que coletou um monte de assinaturas falando da necessidade da derrota do Bolsonaro no ano passado, nos ajudou muito na luta aqui, Miguel, e a gente precisa seguir com a solidariedade de vocês, ainda mais agora que o movimento negro, que a luta em memória do George Floyd e as mulheres derrotaram Trump nos Estados Unidos. Na Bolívia a gente viu a derrota do golpe, no Chile o povo chileno conquistou a possibilidade de uma constituinte, no Equador, né, se derrotou o pacote do Lenin Moreno. Então, no Brasil, a gente espera e luta para que novos ventos soprem aqui, mas certamente a solidariedade internacional é fundamental para isso, para derrotar o vírus da estupidez e da extrema-direita e para derrotar também esse sistema do capital que transforma tudo em mercadoria, inclusive a vacina. Parabéns pela iniciativa e contem comigo nessa luta e conosco do pessoal nessa luta pela quebra das patentes.
Muchas gracias, Fernanda. Si queréis, abrimos ahora también el turno de palabras y de debate. No sé si cualquiera podéis levantar la mano y podéis intervenir. Olivier os daría la palabra. También hay algunas preguntas que se han puesto por el chat, de preguntas y respuestas. No sé si alguien quiere romper un poco el hielo y empezar a hablar, a preguntar, o también hacer una pequeña intervención, no más de 2 minutos, para favorecer el debate. Si no, empezamos entonces con una de las preguntas que hay en el chat para ir rompiendo un poco el hielo, ¿no? Pues una persona anónima nos comentaba que exactamente, espectador anónimo pone justamente, nos comentaba que si aplicamos la excepción TRIPS, si esto puede incentivar, desincentivar al sector privado a innovar para la próxima pandemia, porque dice que, nos guste o no, hemos dependido totalmente de ellos, y que si no innovaran podría ser un verdadero problema. No sé si alguno de los panelistas queréis empezar respondiendo a este espectador anónimo.
I can take a stab at that, Miguel.
Perfecto, Benny, pues empieza tú.
I think there's enough research to show that a lot of the private sector funding for research comes from public and government sources. I remember seeing a report a few weeks ago, I can try and find that and put the link on the chat, where just on COVID vaccines, I think more than $90 billion for the development of vaccines and for advanced market contracts came from government funding. So the profits that the vaccine companies are making is on top of a massive amount of infusion of public support for the vaccine research. So I don't think waiving TRIPS provisions will necessarily lead to lack of innovation. In fact, one of the lessons from the pandemic is that we need the public sector to lead up on research, and maybe that's a lesson that governments will take from the pandemic. But I will try and send you the link to this research that shows that it's actually public funding that is incentivizing the research, not just on COVID vaccines, but on a range of medicines and medical products.
Muchas gracias, Benny. No sé si cualquiera, tanto Levolán o Fernanda, queréis comentar algo sobre esta pregunta.
Muito rapidinho, Miguel, posso comentar? Só que, primeiro, não é verdade que foi o setor privado que investiu. Todos os governos, toda essa pesquisa feita pelas grandes farmacêuticas contou com dinheiro público, de contratos feitos com os governos anterior ao desenvolvimento da vacina. Claro que à medida que eles desenvolveram a vacina, ficou patenteado pelos laboratórios farmacêuticos, mas quem financiou, em última, o desenvolvimento das pesquisas foi o dinheiro do povo. E quem desenvolveu a possibilidade das vacinas foram os cientistas. Então, claro, como eles tinham um parque tecnológico, as condições para fazer o desenvolvimento e o contrato com grandes cientistas internacionais fica patenteado na mão, né, das farmacêuticas, mas não é verdade que foi o setor privado que investiu. Aliás, essa é uma das balelas do capitalismo, que eles sempre dizem que defendem o Estado mínimo, né? O capitalismo na sua fase neoliberal é o Estado mínimo para os interesses da maioria do povo, mas é o Estado máximo para os interesses das grandes corporações. Não existe grandes corporações sem dinheiro a fundo perdido dos bancos públicos nos estados, sem a negociação envolvendo as barreiras econômicas dos países e, no caso da vacina, sem dinheiro público para o desenvolvimento da vacina.
Miguel, just to add on the points that Fernanda and Benny made, just to completely concur with them, that a large amount of the resources that the private pharmaceutical companies relied on were from tax revenue and were financed by the public. I think what we need to start, and I think, you know, in previous times we were taught that, you know, state intervention in pharmaceuticals should be discouraged. But out of this experience, as the trade union movement, we believe that, you know, there should be greater participation of the state, especially when it comes to research and development. So we continue to call for the establishment of a state pharmaceutical company, because had those been in place, governments could have easily used their resources and their tax revenue to finance research and development into the development of a vaccine. But that didn't happen because we've always discouraged the state's involvement in pharmaceutical companies, and those have only been a case for the private sector to accumulate their wealth in. Whether we like it or not, private interests prevail when it comes to issues like this. So what has happened is exactly the characteristics of capitalism and private sector involvement. They have prioritized profits before people's lives. So I think as much as possible as the left, we should continue to call for state involvement, call for the state to be actors in research and development, as well as in the establishment of state pharmaceutical companies, because that is the only way we could beat market forces.
Muchas gracias. Roland Kulke preguntaba si COVAX solo prevé comprar vacunas de multinacionales occidentales o también de Rusia o China. No sé si Benny.
Yes, that's right. As far as I know, neither the Indian, Chinese, or Russian vaccines are part of COVAX as yet. At least I can speak on the India case. The Indian vaccine that's currently rolling out in India is actually going through its third phase trials. So that's maybe one of the reasons why the Indian vaccine is not part of the COVAX facility. Maybe that's a similar case with the Chinese and Russian vaccine as well. But yes, that point is correct that none of those vaccines from the South are yet part of the rollout of COVAX.
Muchas gracias, Benny. Bueno, yo creo que también es muy importante también no entrar justamente en una especie de guerra de diplomacia de las vacunas, ¿no? De hecho, vimos unas declaraciones, yo creo, bastante desafortunadas del alto representante Borrell hablando de cómo se tenía que utilizar COVAX por parte de la Unión Europea en una especie de diplomacia de vacunas para fomentar los intereses geoestratégicos europeos. Pero había otra pregunta, si no me equivoco, de Jack Mathiesen, que hablaba de cómo es que Chile ha podido adelantar en la carrera de vacunación, por ejemplo, a la Unión Europea. No sé si Fernanda o Leolán queréis hablar sobre el caso chileno. Sobre el caso chileno, alguien, no sé si queríais comentar.
Pelo que eu sei, Miguel, o Pinheira começou a negociação em maio do ano passado com as farmacêuticas, e antes do desenvolvimento da vacina, ele fez um acordo de financiamento, né, para apostar no desenvolvimento da pesquisa. Eu estou vendo qual a vacina que eles pegaram mas de fato eles imunizaram já milhões de pessoas, assim, é o único caso de toda a América Latina que tem uma imunização maior, né, em relação aos outros países. Mas eles fizeram acordo com a Pfizer, pelo que eu vi aqui, estava dando uma pesquisadinha, e assim que saiu a vacina, feito esse acordo anterior, em maio do ano passado, quando desenvolveu a vacina no final do ano, foi uma das primeiras a ter essas vacinas desembarcando. No caso do Brasil, a Pfizer fez a proposta para o Bolsonaro. Era uma proposta no meio do ano que previa aquisição de 70 milhões de doses assim que tivesse. E claro, né, numa situação que a vacina salva vidas, e salva muitas vidas nos países que estão... Enfim, todos os países perderam muita gente. No caso do Brasil, o segundo maior país com óbitos, eles sequer consideraram a proposta, descartaram, etc., assim como fizeram luta política com as outras vacinas. No caso da China, desmerecendo a vacina chinesa, falando coisas absurdas da vacina chinesa, por um problema de que o Bolsonaro é vinculado não só com os interesses dos Estados Unidos, mas com a extrema-direita estadunidense. Para vocês terem uma ideia, quando teve a invasão do Capitólio, ele ficou quieto, porque ele defende a extrema-direita estadunidense, não é nem que defende os interesses imperialistas, é sim uma política de extrema-direita, então faz uma guerra política contra a China, dificultando o acesso e o IVA, né? Mas, então, a gestão da vacina por parte do Bolsonaro foi um desastre. Mas eu só quero alertar que as cláusulas da Pfizer são ruins, né? Não é que são boas. À medida que eles controlam a tecnologia, eles passam toda a responsabilidade por reações adversas, etc., para os países que adquirem a vacina. É evidente que numa situação que a gente está perdendo vidas, bom, paciência, né? É preciso negociar a aquisição das vacinas e, no caso da gente que é internacionalista, como tu bem disseste, não fomentar uma guerra diplomática. Não fomentar uma guerra diplomática que, ou, enfim, no caso da Europa, de fazer uma guerra diplomática com o tema da vacina. Mas, de fato, né, à medida que essas grandes corporações têm o controle e têm a tecnologia do desenvolvimento da vacina, fica na mão deles e a possibilidade que eles apresentam aos países para a gente ter acesso, né? Então, a quebra das patentes é uma luta muito urgente.
Justamente entrando con esto.
There's a question specifically on corporate control over COVAX. Can I address that?
Claro, Benny, todo tuyo.
Yeah, so if you look at the structure of COVAX, the COVAX coordination mechanism is co-chaired by
Anónimo que no para de mandarme.
the CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which is a Davos-led, World Economic Forum-led process. The other facility is Gavi, and then you also have the WHO. Now, these are the three sort of, groups that are convening COVAX. But the WHO is not given a chairing role in the COVAX coordinating meeting. The other members of the COVAX coordination meetings include two other members from Gavi. There are other members from CEPI. There are industry partner representatives from the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. Then there are other network that I mentioned, which is the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturing Network. And missing from this governance structure are government representatives. You know, the bulk of developing countries that are supposedly receiving these vaccines. So they don't have any role. There's no oversight role for civil society, which is why my first point was to underline this is a classic PPP that is unaccountable, that is undemocratic, that is undermining, you know, the multilateral democratic framework, which could have been reclaimed during the pandemic. So, I mean, it's a new body, but I think these concerns about transparency over which contracts, I mean, the question linked to why not the Chinese or Russian or Indian vaccines is part of this. There's no reports, there's no access to information about what goes inside these coordinating meetings of COVAX.
Bueno, yo simplemente apuntar tanto de lo que decía Beni como de lo que decía Fernanda, tanto de esta última como de la anterior de Chile. Yo creo que vemos como la opacidad de las multinacionales es un verdadero problema para enfrentar. Hemos visto incluso una auténtica, que lo que prevalecía es la lex mercatoria, ¿no? Del poder corporativo sobre los bienes comunes y sobre la vida, ¿no? Hemos sabido de chantajes de multinacionales a países del sur exigiendo precios más altos y condiciones más duras. Lo hemos visto con Argentina, que incluso les pedían que pusieran como avales de garantías a los contratos bienes del Estado como embajadas o incluso bases militares. O sea, esto se ha sabido, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que lo de Chile podría ser Chile o podría ser otro país. La cuestión es cómo hemos entrado en una carrera de vacunación totalmente descontrolada, irracional, que solo sirve a los intereses del mercado, de las multinacionales y de las farmacéuticas, pero incluso que no solo es injusta, sino que es profundamente ilógica. O sea, hasta que no enfrentemos de una forma global la cuestión de la pandemia y de la vacunación, hasta que el virus no entiende de fronteras, no entiende de fronteras, y hasta que no estemos vacunadas y protegidas todas, no habremos acabado justamente con ese virus. Con lo cual esta carrera no solo es injusta, sino que también es irracional desde un punto de vista sanitario, ¿no? Y yo creo que pone de manifiesto la necesidad de mecanismos multilaterales, democráticos de gobernanza ante el desgobierno y la desgobernanza global del neoliberalismo y del capitalismo, ¿no? Con reglas justas. Justamente Beni o Legolán hablaban de cómo la OMS podría jugar ese papel, pero yo lo que hemos visto a día de hoy es que, por ejemplo, la OMC está al servicio de los países del norte y COVAX está al servicio de las multinacionales farmacéuticas, con lo cual no tenemos un espacio en donde podríamos hablar de esta cuestión de multilateralismo, ¿no? Yo creo que las ponentes podéis ver también las preguntas, lo digo por si queréis ir, lo digo porque tenemos hasta ahí 20, lo digo porque podéis ir respondiendo si queréis. Hay, si no que equivoco, había una de Lorena también, Lorena Delgado, que yo creo que podría ser directamente para Beni, sobre la cuestión de cómo presionar a la Unión Europea para que se puedan seguir los ejemplos, ¿no? De Sudáfrica e India en la cuestión de suspender la propiedad intelectual. Yo creo que sobre eso venía hablado, pero bueno, por si quiere ahondar, yo creo que podríamos ir respondiendo directamente los ponentes a las preguntas que han ido saliendo. Levolán también puede... Justamente esta pregunta de Lorena yo creo que puede ir directamente también para ella, como vosotras veáis.
Thanks, Miguel. I would like, so there's a different question that I would like to answer. I think it grabbed my attention, and it's from Anonymous, and it really was around, could vaccines have been developed as fast as they are now if there were no incentives for the private sector to do it? So I think experiences around how fast or how slow vaccines are being developed differs according to where you are in the world. Maybe yourselves in the global north, you would view it as being fast development of vaccines. However, here in the global south, I explained in my input that, you know, we've only received 80,000 vaccines, and this is for a population of 57 million people. So that tells you how we're doing in comparison to the rest of the world. So for us, the development of vaccines is happening very slow. And I would think that's the incentive for the pharmaceutical companies and the private sector, because what we're seeing is that there seems to be an incentive for the private sector to create blockages. There is an incentive for the private sector to participate in gatekeeping, reserve vaccines for those who are able to pay, and to pay quicker and to pay in large amounts. So for us, we see that there's been a greater incentive for curbing distribution and curbing development for countries in the global south. So like I said, it depends on where you are in the world, but we see that, you know, for the private sector, there's been a great incentive to slow down the development of vaccines for us here in the South. And we've seen what the incentive has been, because for us in the global South, the vaccine prices have been hiked as compared to what the rest of the world is paying for them. So I do think would have been a good thing for countries to have done with this vaccine development process was there to be a bit of participation from the private and the public sector, where both the state and private enterprises come together for the development and the distribution of vaccines. Because currently what we're seeing is that, you know, we've given the incentive. We have given enough incentive for the private sector. We've given them the resources to develop these vaccines. However, we've attached no conditionality. So we've given them the blank check to do as they want to. We have given them zero conditions. We've not given them, you know, the roadmap for how they need to distribute, what the conditions need to be, how they should enhance access. So really what we've done is we've handed the private sector a blank check. So that's the incentive that they got. They got a blank check to take state resources and do with them whatever. And what has that done for poor people and working class people? What has that meant for people in the global South? It means that we must rely on this COVAX facility. And Miguel is right. You know, there's utterances that, you know, the EU or partners in the EU will give Africa 30 million vaccines. I mean, South Africa alone has a population, and we're a smaller country in Africa. We've got a population of 57 million people. It's not even a dent when it comes to, you know, vaccination of the entire population. So I think we have not given enough conditions to the private sector and the multilateral pharmaceutical companies. And I think that's what should have accompanied the process of vaccine development as well as distribution.
If I can take Lebohang's point a little further and expand on that question, which is, what is it that we can do now to speed up the production of vaccines? And, you know, the TRIPS waiver will allow countries to give permissions to unutilized domestic production facilities. And we could, you know, set up a multilateral global humanitarian relief fund, which is underwritten by, you know, rich countries that could be funding countries to produce the vaccines. And as you democratize vaccine production, the cost is going to come down much. And yeah, so therefore, I mean, I think in terms of speeding up the vaccine production, there can be incentives to private sectors in the global South to do it through some sort of a fund rather than what is currently being done through COVAX.
No sé si, Fernanda, 2 minutos más o menos para concluir, por si quieres responder a alguna de las preguntas. De hecho, hay una pregunta directamente, yo creo que para ti, sobre Brasil. Y luego yo ya cierro y le damos paso a nuestra copresidenta Manu Obri.
Não quer fazer já a pergunta, Miguel, diretamente para mim? Eu acho que é melhor, porque eu estou contemplada pelas respostas anteriores.
Si quieres decir algo, si quieres decir algo sobre las anteriores reflexiones, o también hay una en el chat de preguntas, la última aborda sobre la cuestión de Brasil y Pfizer que habías mencionado en tu intervención.
Não, o acordo que eles ofereceram foi no meio do ano. E eu acho que uma das coisas mais graves, não só, mas uma das coisas mais graves é o preço, que de fato, né, os valores cobrados pelas vacinas e o valor que eles cobram dos países é surreal, né? Nessa guerra das vacinas, as grandes indústrias farmacêuticas aproveitam para botar o preço lá em cima. E o segundo é uma cláusula que, inclusive, é uma luta antiga nossa aqui no Brasil, eu suponho que de vocês também, na Espanha, em outros lugares, que é o termo de responsabilidade com relação à possibilidade de efeitos adversos na população que toma vacina, né? Ou, no caso também de quem é voluntário para o desenvolvimento das vacinas, não foi esse caso da Pfizer, mas é em outros casos com a indústria farmacêutica, que a Pfizer absolutamente se desresponsabilizava de qualquer efeito colateral, qualquer adversidade, qualquer tema judicial, colocando a responsabilidade para os países que adquirirem as doses. É um pouco o debate que nós fazemos sobre a responsabilização do poder corporativo e que nós fizemos juntos na ONU quando nos encontramos pessoalmente, né, Miguel, junto com os movimentos, que é a responsabilização das grandes empresas transnacionais. Eles já colocam cláusulas no acordo que dificulta muito a responsabilização depois, acontecendo qualquer coisa, dentro da justiça desses países, porque nós ainda não temos um tratado vinculante, e esta é uma luta que nós temos em comum, para que se possa, né, ter essa responsabilização global, porque são empresas transnacionais, e é evidente que a responsabilização deveria ser global. Se não acontece como aconteceu no Equador, teve o caso da Chevron, a Chevron sai, e aí tu não consegue responsabilizar, ou mesmo nós aqui, com o tema da Vale, Brumadinho e Mariana, etc., né? Que tem uma dificuldade enorme de responsabilização de uma grande empresa transnacional que tem tentáculos em todos os países. É claro que o Bolsonaro foi tão negacionista que não desenvolveu nenhum acordo anterior e, inclusive, fez campanha contra a vacina, porque no desespero da população poder viver, evidente que tu tem que tentar garantir o máximo de vacinas possíveis. Ele fez o contrário, porque nós estamos num passo atrás ainda do resto dos países, e quando eu falo isso é atrás mesmo, né? É um presidente negacionista contra máscara, contra isolamento social, estimula a aglomeração, não desenvolveu, né, as políticas para garantir a vacinação em massa, inclusive recomendou tratamentos claramente não eficazes para o caso do Covid-19, que é a cloroquina. Muita gente tomou uma medicação que não tinha nenhuma comprovação científica e acabou morrendo. Então, claro, nós estamos no -0 aqui no Brasil, né? Que é tentar garantir, estancar a crise e ter alguma responsabilidade. Bolsonaro nem deu bola e não aceitou esse acordo, mas tem esses problemas, sim, né? Em relação... Por isso que a luta da quebra das patentes é importante e a luta por um tratado vinculante internacional, para que a gente consiga responsabilizar depois, porque é óbvio que os países e as pessoas precisam viver nesse momento. E nós aqui vivemos isso com a Pfizer e vivemos com a Sinovac, que é a vacina chinesa, uma guerra ideológica. Ideológica parece que saindo da Guerra Fria, né? Parece que saindo da Guerra Fria, em que eles, enfim, fizeram política contra, na prática, o governo chinês e inviabilizaram um acordo que o Brasil pudesse receber os insumos para produzir as vacinas, porque o governo de São Paulo fez um acordo com o Butantan, então nós temos tecnologia para desenvolver a vacina aqui, mas nós não temos o IVA, que são os insumos para produzir essas vacinas, que só a Índia e a China têm. E essa relação negacionista, esse ataque que eles fizeram à China, obviamente dificultou muito o acesso ao IVA para que a gente pudesse desenvolver a vacina, né? O Butantan tem a condição de produzir 1 milhão de doses por dia da vacina chinesa e tem cientistas, tem pesquisadores, tem condições técnicas de produzir. Só que esse obscurantismo nos levou até a não ter os insumos necessários para produzir em larga escala as vacinas salvando vidas, né? Então, a gente está aí um dos países que menos vacinou no meio da maior crise do Covid-19 desde o início da pandemia.
Muchas gracias, Fernanda. Ya vamos a cerrar este panel. Yo quería cerrar sobre todo respondiendo a Lorena Delgado, que justamente nos preguntaba cómo conseguíamos que la Unión Europea no siguiera los dictados de las multinacionales y que pudiera liberar la cuestión de las patentes. Yo creo que no podemos confiar en la Unión Europea. No podemos confiar en la Unión Europea, igual que no podemos confiar en COVAX, ni podemos confiar en el buen hacer simplemente de las multinacionales, ¿no? O no solo apelar a leyes que suponen correlaciones de fuerzas, o sea, que responden realmente a correlaciones de fuerzas, ¿no? Yo creo que o hablar en abstracto de mecanismos o multilaterales democráticos que corrijan estos desequilibrios. Necesitamos justamente que haya un movimiento popular que presione a los gobiernos para liberar estas patentes. Un movimiento popular que pueda coger la cuestión de las vacunas como una excusa para hablar de un debate central que es el de la vida o la propiedad, la vida o el beneficio, y que reclame que nuestras vidas valen mucho más que los beneficios de un puñado de multinacionales. Y yo creo que ahí, desde Europa, pero también desde el sur, tenemos el deber de levantar ese movimiento popular, internacionalista, solidario, que aborde estos debates, que pueda enfrentar la cuestión de las vacunas, pero como dentro de un debate más general, dentro de un debate general entre la incompatibilidad del capitalismo a día de hoy con la vida. Y yo creo que ahí, por ejemplo, desde la izquierda europea, desde nuestro grupo, hemos apoyado la iniciativa ciudadana europea Rescure para defender el acceso universal a las vacunas del COVID y la transparencia en los contratos, y son elementos muy importantes. Pero hasta que no pongamos en el centro de que la vacunación es un derecho humano, que las vacunas deben de ser un bien público global, que la cuestión de la defensa de los bienes comunes es defender la democracia, y que solo justamente desde unos mecanismos democráticos, multilaterales, bajo control social, podremos enfrentar esta crisis en la que nos encontramos. El reto, evidentemente, es mayúsculo, es inmenso, pero yo creo que no tenemos tiempo para ser pesimistas. Solo nos queda ser optimistas de que podemos enfrentar justamente este reto, y ese reto solo lo podremos enfrentar desde la unidad del norte y del sur, de las clases populares, contra una minoría peligrosa que quiere seguir viviendo a costa de nuestra miseria. Y nada más, yo le pasaría la palabra a nuestra copresidenta Manon Aubry para que cierre justamente estas jornadas. Muchas gracias.
Bonjour à tous, j'espère que vous m'entendez, que vous m'entendez bien. Merci beaucoup, Miguel. Un grand merci à toi particulièrement d'avoir amené ce sujet, de le porter. Un grand merci aussi à tous nos invités de partout dans le monde, que ce soit d'Afrique du Sud, d'Inde ou du Brésil, pour parler de cet enjeu global et pour parler d'un sujet qui manifestement ne plaît pas beaucoup aux grands de ce monde, que ce soit aux grandes entreprises ou aux pays européens, puisqu'on touche là à un fondamental du libéralisme, vous en avez parlé, et de ce concept de privatisation du marché, alors même que ces vaccins, ils ont été développés avec de l'argent public, avec notre argent. Et il y a un paradoxe à se dire que les gains derrière sont privatisés par ces entreprises, alors que si elles font des pertes, elles seront socialisées. Et c'est pour ça que nous, on a eu un mot d'ordre. Tu as parlé de la campagne, Miguel, on a eu un mot d'ordre avec une campagne majeure qui dit simplement pas de profit sur la pandémie, qu'on ne peut pas faire du profit sur la santé des êtres humains et qui plus est sur la santé des êtres humains, que ce soit en France, en Espagne, en Afrique du Sud, en Ouganda ou en Inde. Et cette espèce de guerre au vaccin qui a été celle de ces derniers mois, elle est inefficace à tout point de vue. Elle est d'abord inefficace sur le plan moral parce que se dire qu'il y en a qui ont un accès privilégié au vaccin par rapport à d'autres, c'est évidemment inégal, mais c'est aussi inefficace, y compris d'un point de vue sanitaire, sinon l'épidémie reviendra comme un boomerang. Et on voit bien que dans ce contexte-là, on a eu plusieurs problèmes, avec au cœur de ces problèmes à la fois des entreprises multinationales qui sont organisées par l'appât du gain et des États qui défendent ces entreprises multinationales. Et donc, à la fin, on se retrouve à avoir des entreprises qui sont incapables de produire ce dont on a besoin dans le monde parce qu'il y a des sacro-saints brevets et que ces brevets, il ne faut absolument pas y toucher. Ils sont la propriété exclusive des entreprises pharmaceutiques. Et ce, alors même que ces entreprises ne sont même pas capables de tenir leur livraison qui était promise. Et au final, on se retrouve avec cette conséquence très claire de 75% des vaccinations qui ont lieu dans seulement 10 États dans le monde, ce qui crée une sorte de cycle infernal où, en fait, entre-temps, le virus se développe, il y a les différents variants qu'on voit apparaître partout dans le monde et les conséquences que l'on connaît d'un point de vue social et économique. Et donc, la question qui est posée, c'est comment on ne cède pas à ce chantage des grandes entreprises multinationales et des labos pharmaceutiques qui se vendent au plus offrant, en quelque sorte, et comment on reprend le pouvoir, parce que oui, j'ai la naïveté de penser que des États sont plus forts que des entreprises pharmaceutiques et que c'est à nous, politiques, de faire la loi et de l'imposer à ces grandes entreprises globalement, qui se lavent les mains, qui disent on produit ces vaccins, on veut faire des bénéfices dessus, le tout grâce à de l'argent public, et en plus de tout ça, on se dédouane de nos responsabilités, notamment en cas d'effets secondaires. Donc l'enjeu maintenant, pour donner une tonalité positive et le combat que nous on mène, c'est comment on reprend ce pouvoir sur les big pharma et comment on sort de cette logique qui est celle à l'heure actuelle de la Commission européenne qui baisse quasiment les bras. Moi, ce qui m'a frappé, c'est la présidente de la Commission européenne, Ursula von der Leyen, qui s'avoue presque vaincue et qui dit que la Commission européenne et les 27 États membres sont plus faibles et qu'on est incapable d'imposer des conditions aux labos, qu'on est incapable d'imposer la transparence des contrats, qu'on est incapable de leur faire respecter leurs délais de livraison, comme si finalement, littéralement, la Commission européenne s'était couchée devant ces labos pharmaceutiques. Donc, il y a cet aveu d'impuissance qu'on doit dépasser. Et puis, il y a aussi une forme d'hypocrisie, parce que quand on a moi, en tant que Français, je peux particulièrement en parler, un dirigeant politique, Emmanuel Macron, qui a un discours qui parle de bien public mondial, sur les vaccins, d'accessibilité internationale, etc., et qui, dans le même temps, bloque les négociations au niveau de l'Organisation mondiale du commerce qui permettent une dérogation à la sacro-sainte règle de la propriété intellectuelle qui empêche qui empêche la levée de ces brevets et qui empêche une production massive de vaccins dont on a besoin. Donc l'enjeu, c'est comment on demande des comptes aussi à ces États. La France, qui fait partie des États qui bloquent dans les négociations de l'Organisation mondiale du commerce, et les États membres de l'Union européenne doivent être aux côtés des plus de 120 États. Et quand on parle de démocratie, quand on a 120 États dans le monde qui demandent la levée de ces brevets, alors notre rôle est d'être aux côtés de ces États. Et nous le disons clairement, notre groupe de la gauche au Parlement européen, on sera aux côtés de ces États. Et on continue à se battre ici pour demander des comptes à la Commission européenne, à la fois pour qu'elle reprenne son rôle de contrôle des labos pharmaceutiques, mais qu'en plus, elles permettent le déblocage des négociations au niveau international. Je crois que c'est un devoir de solidarité internationale qui est le nôtre, mais c'est aussi, et j'entendais la fin des débats qui en parlaient, c'est une question aussi de vision de notre société et de reddition des comptes de la part de ces grandes entreprises multinationales qui se croient au-dessus des lois et qui pensent être en capacité de fixer elles-mêmes leurs propres lois. Et nous, notre rôle ici au Parlement européen a toujours été de se battre pour fixer des règles à ces grandes entreprises multinationales. On se bat aussi pour qu'il y ait un devoir de vigilance de ces entreprises multinationales et qu'elles ne fassent pas faire le sale boulot à d'autres et qu'elles disent « nous, on est responsable de rien ». Grâce à la pression citoyenne ces derniers mois, on a quand même réussi à obtenir quelques avancées, quelques contrats qui commencent à être publiés. Le président du Parlement européen qui dit lui-même que la levée des brevets ne doit pas être un tabou. C'est une première brèche qui devra s'agrandir pour faire jouer la solidarité internationale et pour qu'ensemble, on soit plus fort que les labos pharmaceutiques pour faire face à cette pandémie, relever la tête collectivement dans l'Union européenne et ailleurs. Et enfin, entrevoir une lumière au bout du tunnel pour sortir de cette période qui a été extrêmement difficile à vivre partout dans le monde et se dire qu'une bonne fois pour toutes, les profits ne l'auront pas emporté sur la santé. En tout cas, c'est notre combat ici majeur au Parlement européen et vous pouvez compter sur nous pour le mener. Un grand merci à tous nos intervenants de nouveau, un grand merci à Miguel pour l'organisation. Et j'espère qu'on pourra bientôt revenir sur cet épisode en se disant que des choses auront bougé, des règles auront bougé, tant au niveau européen qu'au niveau international. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Muchas gracias, Mano. Como sabéis, estas jornadas duran 2 días y os voy a pasar, le voy a pasar la palabra a Caterina Conexa, diputada del GUE, para que nos comente también los paneles y los temas que abordaremos mañana como coordinadora de las jornadas. Muchas gracias.
Hello, you are hearing me? Thanks. Thanks a lot for this morning, everybody, because thank you to all the speakers and you who took part in the debate. I hope that for you as well as for me, it was 3.5 hours during which we learned a lot of interesting information that will help us in our work and in the future. And we know that many limitations are only political decisions. We are politicians, me, Miguel, Helmut, everybody who was here today. And I promise you that we will try to change them because it's no longer possible to accept that only the big and select few will win the pandemic. We have a non-profit pandemic campaign, as Manon said, and let me ask you to not only support it, but also spread it among your colleagues and friends. Let us show the European Commission that it can no longer let its friends and big pharma earn at the expense of all the inhabitants in all planet. Don't forget, please, colleagues, that we continue tomorrow from 2 o'clock, again with interesting speakers and on a very current topic. We will be more interested in the situation within the EU, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow from 2 o'clock. Thanks also to our translator and all those who technically ensured that our conference took place. Thank you very much, our staff, our translator, everybody who will be with us today, and thank you very much you that you spend the time with us, and looking for tomorrow from 2 o'clock with interesting debates which will continue on these topics. Thank you very much.